Yo, what's good, my great sages? It's your host HD Sim right here, bringing y'all a new What If. This being the What If movie to What If Luffy was Kakashi's reincarnation. I want to say thank you to everyone who decided to tune in, as today we're going to see exactly how things would go if Kakashi the copy ninja from the world of Naruto had all his skills and experiences transferred over to the world of One Piece, and more precisely, to Monkey D. Luffy. As now with that being said, y'all, I got nothing else to say. So with that being said, let's get started.
You're never gonna make it, you're not good enough. There's a million other people with the same stuff. You really think you're different? Man, you must be kidding. Think you're gonna hit it, but you just don't get it. It's impossible, it's not probable, you're irresponsible. Too many obstacles, you gotta stop it, yo. You gotta take it slow, you can't be a pro. Don't waste your time no more. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
So to begin the what if, we're now going to start off with Luffy's origins. So dating way back, all the way up to the point where Luffy's at the age of 5, we will see him currently right now just chilling on top of a rooftop, as he would just be watching the clouds go by with a bored expression. As Luffy will be currently right now in deep thought, which I know it would be very much a shocker, but Luffy would be there thinking about everything that just recently happened, as we now do a flashback. Cause you see, on the previous day prior, Luffy had just finally turned 5 years old, as his birthday was most recent. But you see, on that very day that Luffy would turn 5 years old, this is where we would then see the awakening of someone else. As after many years of laying dormant, this is where we then see the awakening of the soul of Kakashi Hatake, the copy ninja, and also the 6th Hokage of the Hidden Leaf, or at least he used to be. As immediately after his soul had been awakened, we would then see Luffy then get hit with an influx of memories that were not his own, as he will see a completely different world, a completely different power system, and just the experiences of everything that Kakashi had went through. With Obito, with Rin, his growing up, what happened to his father, Team 7, everything. All the way to the very last time he would be shown alive. And Luffy would be there just completely in shock before finally he would then fall unconscious, which by the way at the time Luffy was casually staying with Garp. As Garp would then rush over to Luffy asking if he was okay. As we now end up cutting back to the present. By this point now, it's only been a couple of weeks after Luffy's birthday, as right now Kakashi was just trying to find out exactly what to do. He tried to give the body back, he had tried everything, but unfortunately without the use of chakra at this very moment, he couldn't do so. And not only that, but it wasn't as if there was a secret technique right now that he could use to just give the body back to the soul. So due to that, Kakashi was now just stuck here. He didn't know exactly what to do. There was nothing he could do. But after thinking things over once again, as Kakashi had continued looking up into the clouds, wondering what his next move is, this is when he would then casually end up getting up, as he ends up apologizing to Luffy, as unfortunately while he couldn't give him back his body and everything, all Kakashi can do is try to make sure that this kid is strong and actually have a good life in store for him. So that way if he ever were to come back, Luffy wouldn't be in a completely hopeless situation. As now with that final thought in Kakashi's, or should I say Luffy's mind, this is where we now end up doing a ginormous time skip. So we now flash forward to now a couple of months after Kakashi still had been awakened and after he made the plan to help Luffy grow stronger. As by this point now, we would see Luffy as he'll be constantly training up his new body, and that's to the point where he was already stronger than the average kid at his age. I mean, Luffy was already stronger than the average kid, but now he was even stronger than that, as he was now strong enough to the point where he was able to use chakra, as he had been doing chakra exercises that Kakashi remembered from his old life. But you see, while Kakashi, or should I say Luffy, was doing this, Garp had taken notice of all of this. Now he didn't know exactly what was going on with Luffy, and he didn't really get to see the chakra training or anything like that, but he could already tell that his grandson was most definitely growing stronger, as he could just sense Luffy's growth and strength. And not only that, but he also notices Luffy's change of personality, as instead of being outgoing, loud, and just, overall a chaotic mess that's waiting to happen, Luffy was much more calm, more reserved. He actually seemed clever, which was shocking from someone from Garp's family at least, as the only other person he could really think about that was similar like that was, well, Dragon. And even then, Dragon had his own comedic moments that Garp could remember. But still, this made Garp then realize a couple of things. As number one would be the fact that Luffy was growing up, and that was something that Garp needed to realize now. And the second thing he realized was the fact that he should start taking Luffy more seriously, since now that Luffy's personality was truly developing, or at least that's what Garp had seen, this is where he then realizes that he can't exactly keep, treating Luffy as a baby anymore, as this is where his third idea came in, this being the fact that Garp has decided that from today on he will then begin training Luffy. as just based off of everything he had just seen from Luffy, he knows that that kid is more than ready for it. As now with those thoughts plaguing Garp's mind, this is where we will then see him release an evil smile on his face, as this is where we now do another time skip for a couple months. Now for the couple months that went by, we will see Garp as he will begin training Luffy, with him at first taking it easy on him by leaving him in different islands to fend for himself. But sooner or later he then began to realize that that was too easy for Luffy, as he decided to take Luffy to an actual marine base, so that way he can be properly trained and see how the marine life is. As Luffy will be there actually training along with the marine soldiers that were there, with many of the soldiers wondering if Garp was being way too harsh, with Garp telling them to shut up, as after all Luffy was his grandson, and that means he's able to easily take whatever they could actually, handle, which was actually true. As thanks to the training that Kakashi already put the body through, plus the addition of Garp's training, Luffy was actually able to keep up with the rest of the marine soldiers relatively easily, as in fact he made it look quite easy compared to them who were struggling incredibly hard with it. As we end up seeing Garp have a front row seat to all of this with a ginormous smile on his face, as he ends up laughing at the display that he was seeing, as he can't help but be proud of Luffy's progress, as we end up seeing Luffy continuously training with, once again, a very stoic look on his face as he continues pushing himself. As this is when Garp would then tell Luffy that this was only the beginning and things are about to get way harder later on, as he ends up sending Luffy an evil smile, with Luffy after hearing this saying nothing more, as he just continues on training even harder, as he ends up having a determined expression on his face, to which once again Garp approves of. As just like that, this is where we now end up doing another time skip. But this time, instead of it being months, we're now going to time skip to multiple years now. As we now end up time skipping all the way up to the point where we end up seeing Luffy now currently at the age of 10. Now you see, through the years that went by, Luffy had been harshly trained. Like, his body is a weapon, and that is a simple fact. As legit, based off the training that Kakashi put the body through, as by this point now, he already trained Luffy's body to be just as strong as his old one was at that age. But with the addition of Garp's training, Luffy at this age was way stronger than Kakashi was at that age. So basically, Luffy was already that of a Jonin level shinobi. Because remember, Kakashi became an Anbu when he was only 13 or 12. I don't really know the whole facts behind that, but it was still at an incredibly young age. And Luffy by this point had surpassed that. So yeah, most definitely Luffy was way stronger than his canon counterparts. But what's crazy about this is the fact that this is not even the craziest thing that happened through the years. As you see, thanks to Luffy's training at the marine base, and after spending so many years on there, eventually Luffy had came to the decision to actually become a marine. As after all, Luffy, or should I say Kakashi, had multiple experiences when it came to serving a large organization, more precisely the Hidden Leaf. And the Marines do play a similar aspect to that, mostly due to the fact of how they actually try to protect the civilians from pirates, to which Kakashi, or should I say Luffy, has met his own fair share of them. As during a time whenever Garp would go on adventures, he would actually sometimes bring Luffy along after seeing that he was more than able to defend himself. So due to that, Luffy was able to get first-hand experiences with pirates, and even assist sometimes when it came to taking them down. So due to all this, Luffy already had one reason to join the Marines, but there was also another reason on top of that. This being the simple fact that the Marines actually pay really good. Like, surprisingly, they actually pay really good for people, even for the cheap soldiers that do not do too much on the battlefield when it comes to facing off against bigger pirates, as they get paid very handsomely. As after Luffy truly found out exactly how much money Garp had, he was nearly blown away. As due to Garp being a Vice Admiral and due to all the achievements he had made throughout the years, Garp pretty much had the exact same amount of money as that of someone who became Hokage. And mind you, that is someone, this is only a Vice Admiral's paycheck. Sure, Garp gets a little bit extra because he's, the hero of the Marines, but still, that is quite a lot. And to think that Admirals and even Fleet Admirals made potentially more was honestly frightening to Luffy. But still, nonetheless, this gave him more than enough reason to join the Marines, as he already outweighed the pros and cons of it and decided to actually join them. And what's crazy about the fact is that immediately after Luffy had joined the Marines, he once again showed exactly just how far his strength had went. As during the time that Luffy became a Marine, in only 6 months time that he had been there, he had been able to jump from a just simple Marine grunt to a full-on Marine captain in only 6 months. As somehow, someway, Luffy was able to accomplish the requirements needed to become a Marine captain, that being the countless missions they need to do, the experience and everything, as somehow he was able to do it. As after a recommendation by Garp and also an evaluation test conducted by an Admiral, this being Aokiji by the way, this was enough to get Luffy all the way up to the point of being a Marine captain, surprising and shocking everyone that was in the Marines and also everyone that was outside of them, as this would actually spread all across the world, saying how basically a new rookie had just jumped the ranks of the Marines, as he had been the youngest and also the quickest Marine to actually climb up the ranks. And not only that, but they also introduced Luffy's legacy to the entire world, more precisely that he was Garp's grandson. Now this would of course surprise everyone and struck terror in many pirates, as to them they just saw basically another hero of the Marines just sprouting up right in front of their eyes, with some people actually already thinking that it's nothing more but just a theory or a myth, and many of them even thinking that all this was true, but basically Luffy climbed up the ranks due to his grandfather's backing pretty much. Basically they assumed that the only reason that Luffy was at that rank at his age was due to the fact that Garp was already using his power and control of the Marines to do so, basically making Luffy look like a fraud, to which he most definitely wasn't. As now that I finally caught you guys up on everything, this is where I now flash you guys forward to the present. As we now end up seeing Luffy currently at the age of 10, as he'll be dragged by Garp to an unknown location, as he would just be there reading a book with a bored expression on his face while deeming the very obvious face mask. As you see, that was the one habit that Kakashi was not able to break away even after he got reincarnated. As Luffy would be there reading a book and minding his own business, this is when Garp would then suddenly end up walking over to a nearby house that they finally arrived at. Now when Luffy looked at the house, he just simply sent it a glance before once again turning back to his book and walking away. But while Luffy was walking away and reading his book, this is when suddenly someone would then spit at Luffy, which caused him to dodge out of the way by simply turning his head to the side. And when Luffy ends up seeing the Logi hit the ground, this is when suddenly he turns to the person to see none other than Ace, as he would just be there casually looking down at Luffy with an angry expression. And Luffy looking at Ace, he would just simply send him a bored expression before turning back to his book, not seeing Ace as worth his time. Now this would cause Ace to be even more pissed off, as this was something he then tries to spit on Luffy once again, with Luffy just dodging every single time. And Garp, after finally talking with Dan Dan, would then turn to Luffy and also Ace as he ends up seeing the display happening, and he just laughs before finally approaching Luffy and telling him that he's going to be spending the time here for now, which causes Luffy to look at him with a bored expression, but still nonetheless decides to agree to it. Cause you see, currently right now the youngest Marine captain would be on break, as after accomplishing so many missions at his young age, the Marine organization themselves decided that Luffy needed a little bit of a vacation, just so that way he can rest his little mind, since they don't want to put too much stress on the kid, especially since he's still very much prospering. So with that, this is when Garp decided to chip in, saying that he knows the exact place where he's going to give Luffy a vacation. And lo and behold, he decides to leave Luffy directly at the place where in the main timeline he grew up in, this being where Dan Dan and her crew was. Now after instructing Luffy to stay here for quite a while and that he should enjoy his vacation here with Dan Dan and her crew, this is where we would then see Garp then head off, telling Luffy that he has some business to take care of, to which Luffy obviously knows that that's just bullshit. But still, regardless of that, Luffy ends up casually reading his book before walking inside Dan Dan and her crew's hideout, with Ace just glaring at him the entire time, as already just based on that brief introduction of Luffy, Ace did not like him at all. As in his eyes, just based off that little brief introduction, he could already tell that Luffy was lazy and uncaring, or at least that's what he looks like in his eyes. And due to that, Ace just simply did not like him. Although Luffy, well, he just simply did not care about Ace at all. After all, he was just too invested into his own books. So with that, we see Luffy just casually chilling with Dan Dan and her crew, all the while Ace would be there trying his best to ignore Luffy, as this would continue on for a full month. Now, Luffy had no problem living in the harsh environment of Dan Dan and her crew, considering the fact that Luffy has literally fought pirates and has been in tougher situations, both in this life and his old one. So due to that, he was able to adapt quite easily. But you see, as this would go on for an entire month, finally things would eventually change. Cause you see, on a very certain day, we end up seeing Ace, as currently right now him and Sabo were right now celebrating after they collected a ginormous amount of gold and jewels, as that meant that they finally had enough money to go on their own adventures and become pirates. But you see, while they were in the midst of celebrating, this is when suddenly they would then be ambushed by none other than Blue Jam's crew, as Ace had stolen from them and they were looking for him. And after looking around for quite a while, they did find him and also Sabo. And when they found him, they immediately began to threaten him, and also Sabo as well, as they all surround him, preparing to beat him up and also take away all of the money that he has stolen. Now this will cause both Ace and Sabo to tense, as they realize that all that hard work that they went through for so many years and months was now about to go to waste. As this will cause them to tense up as they prepare to fight, only for basically the leader of this crew to then suddenly approach them, as he then tells them clearly that he's going to kill them, which causes both Ace and Sabo to tense up as they realize that this guy is a real deal. He showed no care at all for their situation, and he was willing to end their lives just to benefit themselves. As Ace and Sabo tense up, preparing for the fight ahead of them, this is when suddenly they will then hear the sound of someone whistling. As suddenly, finally exiting out of the trees, we will see none other than Luffy, as he will just be there casually reading a book and approaching the group. Now, immediately when Ace sees Luffy, he can't help but gasp, as he wonders why exactly is that guy there. As you see, Ace has no idea exactly of Luffy's circumstances, or more precisely, what ranking or what he truly is. But still, nonetheless, the Blue Jam Pirates, when they see Luffy, they immediately threaten him, telling him to leave or else he's gonna get the same treatment as both Ace and Sabo. And Luffy, hearing this, he just tells them that that threat was not gonna work on him, as he tells them that he basically does not care at all about what they just said. And this will cause them to be pissed off, as this is when suddenly the leader of all of them will then approach Luffy before telling him that he's going to be the first one to die, as he then throws a punch at Luffy, with Luffy just casually flipping a page from his book. As this is where in the very next segment, we will then see the very Blue Jam Pirate, as well as the rest of the members that were there, then be completely beaten up, black and blue, as they would be there laid out on the ground, as it looked like they were dead. As both Ace and Sabo would be there just looking on in complete shock, as all that happened in a flash, with Luffy just casually being there in the center around all these bodies, with him just casually reading his book and flipping through the pages, before giggling a little bit. As from now on, from that very day, we would then see both Ace and Sabo then slowly but surely befriend Luffy. As now whenever they got into trouble, Luffy would be there to bail them out, and whenever it came to training, Luffy would be there to assist them. As it took some time, of course, for all of this to happen, but eventually they got there. As Luffy and them sooner or later then become brothers, as Luffy would be there to assist them whenever they would go on adventures. But he wouldn't assist them when it came to robberies, because, you know, he was a Marine captain, but he will help them when it came to like bailing them out if they were to ever get into too much trouble that they couldn't handle. As this will continue on for not even a few months, but even a few years, with it only occasionally stopping whenever Luffy had to get back to work. As this will cause the three of them once again to grow closer as brothers, but sooner or later, after all the training that Luffy put them through, and whenever Luffy went out on the missions, that meant that both Ace and Sabo were actually strong enough to deal with other pirates, and more precisely Blue Jam and his crew. As just like in the main timeline when Blue Jam and his crew confronted Ace and Sabo, and more precisely Sabo's dad was trying to demand him to come back, this time around, instead of all three of them getting their butts handed to them, Ace and Sabo alone were able to take care of the entirety of Blue Jam's crew, and also Sabo was able to take care of his father, giving him a warning saying that to never approach him ever again. So due to that, Ace and Sabo were able to go by pretty easily throughout their childhood without too much struggles because of their strength. As we now end up flashing forward to the next few years that go by. Now just to clear you guys up on a few things, number one, during the years that went by, Sabo was eventually convinced not to go on his adventures early, which means the whole incident when it came to the Celestial Dragon does not happen. As Sabo had a talk with Luffy about it, and Luffy told him to settle down, as after all, he has enough time in the world. After all, there's no one there telling him, oh, you can't go, but once again, there's no one telling him to hurry up and go. So due to that, Sabo decided to take his time and actually stay at the island training along with Ace and also Luffy. As now finally turning to when the brothers are now 17, or more precisely when Ace and Sabo are 17, with Luffy being the youngest, which yeah, Luffy, he's not 17 at this point, no, he's only 14. Everything that Luffy was doing by that point, he was the youngest of the three, which was surprising to them, even now, but still, regardless, they was still very appreciative to their brother. As currently right now, all three brothers were now separating, as both Ace and Sabo decided to go on their own adventures and become pirates, with Luffy sending them off, of course, telling them to behave or he'll end up catching them. Now this will cause a challenge to spring up from the three of them, before eventually they will then settle down, giving each other a hug before finally going their separate ways. As after one last fist bump, This is where we will then see all three of them go off on their own separate adventures, with Ace and Sabo becoming their own individual pirate, with Luffy going back to his work as a marine. As this is where we now end up doing a time skip to the very beginning of canon Luffy's adventure, or better yet, the beginning of the whole One Piece series. As we now first start off with the East Blue Saga, and more precisely, the Romance Dawn arc. As we end up seeing the events of this arc play out pretty similar to the main timeline. As we end up seeing Luffy, currently right now, instead of being in a barrel like he was in the main timeline, he would be on a small miniature marine ship, as currently right now he had been on vacation. After accomplishing so many missions for the Marines, Luffy had a little bit of off time, so he decided to go visit Dan Dan and the rest of the crew, and now that he had finally finished doing that, he was currently right now just chilling in the East Blue. But while Luffy was doing this is when suddenly he would then encounter Alvida, as well as the rest of her crew as they were raiding another ship. And Luffy, even though he was off duty seeing this, would decide no choice but to help, as after all, he was still a marine at the end of the day. So with that being said, this is where we end up seeing Luffy then confront Alvida's crew, to which at first when they saw Luffy they immediately threatened him, even after finding out that he was a marine. But you see, this is when Alvida would then step up, as she then challenges Luffy, as she then tries to actually swing at him with her club. But to the surprise of everyone, while Alvida swings the club, Luffy would be there just casually reading a book, as when the club ends up hitting Luffy, it would then break apart immediately after the contact. As this will end up surprising everyone, especially Alvida, as we end up seeing Luffy just casually read his book before taking his eyes off of it for a moment and turning to Alvida and telling her that she was really weak. Now this will cause Alvida to be extremely pissed off, as this is when suddenly she would then see Kobe and then call out to him, telling him to explain to Luffy who she really was. And Kobe, after seeing what Luffy had just done, and more precisely seeing just how strong Luffy was, this will give Kobe the courage to then tell off right in front of Alvida's face, calling her mean and ugly. And this would piss off Alvida, as she would then charge at Kobe, trying to kill him until Luffy would then intervene. As Luffy would actually chuckle at Kobe's response, telling him that he did a good job, before finally he would then flick Alvida away. And I mean legit flick her away. Like he literally just used 1 or 2 fingers and just flicked her away. That was it. As we end up seeing Alvida then get sent flying out of the ship, with the rest of her crew looking on in complete shock. Until suddenly this is when one of them would then call out, as he would then have a very pale face, as he then recognizes Luffy. Even though he was not fully in his complete attire, he could recognize the mask. It did take him a while, but finally he realized who he was. As after all, he had been the youngest person ever to become a Marine captain. But more precisely and more recently, he had been the youngest person ever at only the age of 14 to become a Vice Admiral. And not only that, but he had been well known for taking down any pirate that stood in his way and bringing them back for their bounty. As the man would then suddenly call out Luffy for his title, the Bloodhound of the Marines, Monkey D. Luffy. Now after hearing that name, this will cause everyone that was there to immediately pale as they realized just who they were messing with. Although Kobe, he would just be there starstruck, as he couldn't believe he was meeting one of his favorite Marines. He had read up on Luffy, seen him multiple times in different magazines and just newspaper articles in general, as he had heard of many of Luffy's exploits, so seeing his hero right in front of him was breathtaking. And Luffy, after hearing all this, would just lazily tell them that they better get off the ship for the next few seconds or else. And that was enough to make Alvida's men immediately tense up as they run away in pure terror. All the while Luffy would be there flipping through his book, as Kobe would just be there starstruck, not moving at all. Now Luffy would then turn to Kobe, begin questioning him, to which of course Kobe was afraid before eventually answering, explaining the whole situation with Alvida, and after Luffy ends up getting caught up on it, this is when surprisingly Luffy would then offer Kobe a chance to join the Marines. As Kobe had midway through the conversation had explained about his whole dream about becoming a Marine, and Luffy seeing that he had the ability to grant that wish, he would then ask Kobe if he wants to join the Marines. And of course, after hearing this, Kobe would be starstruck, as this one suddenly he would then begin to cry, telling Luffy that yes, he absolutely would. As just like that, this is where we then get Kobe actually joining the Marines, as he actually ends up joining Luffy's forces at that very moment. As after the two of them would then, discuss a little bit more, this is where we would then see Luffy then hop back onto his Marine ship, as he ends up explaining to Kobe that he was on vacation at the East Blue at the moment, but now that his vacation was finally wrapping up, it was finally time for him to return back to duty. So with that, they decided to make a few stops along the way as they prepared to get back to Luffy's station, with the first stop being none other than Shellstown, where the events that end up happening there play out pretty similar to the main timeline, all the way up until the end. As you see, the thing is, when Luffy ends up arriving at Shellstown, thanks to him being a higher authority figure of the Marines, this will cause many people to turn their attention onto him, as he would end up arriving there. Now, the Marines that were stationed there would also recognize Luffy and send him the proper respect, as throughout the time of Luffy's traveling to the Marine base, this is when he would then encounter Zoro. Now, Luffy would find out about the whole situation when it came to Zoro, especially when a young little girl ran up to him and began asking for his help. Now, after explaining to Luffy about the whole situation, this is when Luffy then decided to speak with Morgan himself, which, speaking of which, when Morgan found out that Luffy was at his island, he was dreadfully pissed off. As you see, the thing is, he didn't feel okay with the fact that someone younger than him had more authority. So due to that, he immediately challenged Luffy, stating that if he were to win, he would become a Vice Admiral, and that Luffy had to obey him. With Luffy, of course, agreeing to the terms, but basically stating that if Morgan was going to make a challenge like that, then he's going to have to put his very job on the line. As if Luffy wins the fight, then unfortunately Morgan was just simply out of the Marine base, and basically just out of the Marines in general. Now this will piss off Morgan as he would try to face off against Luffy, but unfortunately that would fail horribly, as Morgan ends up losing the battle against Luffy relatively easily, and there was no fight at all. Now this will cause Helmeppo, who had been, using his father's ranking and status to get by pretty easily, to be completely horrified, as just like that, the Marines were free, the villagers were free. Morgan's tyranny was over pretty quickly, and that's mostly because of the fact that Luffy's ranking and his strength. As after that, Luffy would then free Zoro, telling him not to get into any more trouble, but Zoro, after seeing Luffy's strength and after seeing how he was able to take care of Morgan, this is when he would then challenge Luffy to a fight, as he always wanted to find out exactly what is the power of, a Vice Admiral of the Marines. And of course, Luffy hearing this would then accept the challenge, as we end up having Zoro face off against Luffy, with unfortunately Zoro not being able to really win against Luffy, like at all. He stood zero chance. As just in the very beginning of the fight, as Zoro would then rush at Luffy, trying to tackle him with all his 3 swords, Luffy would be able to stop it with just one finger. Similar to that how, Aizen did to Ichigo, Luffy would do the same thing to Zoro. As this will surprise Zoro greatly, as he would then try to attack Luffy sporadically using a bunch of sword styles, but unfortunately Luffy just simply was too skilled. It was almost as if he could see the attacks coming, to which he could. As for those who are still wondering exactly how Luffy is able to do all of this, it's because of Haki. As you see, thanks to Luffy's training at a young age, and thanks to everything that he put through, plus with Kakashi's training as well, and also Garp's training, this will cause Luffy to already by this point be very proficient when it came to Haki. As basically Luffy was just in a completely different league compared to many others in the world of One Piece. As after battling against Zoro, Luffy would be able to defeat him relatively easily without a single scratch on him or his clothing. And this will cause Zoro to immediately have even more respect for Luffy, as right before Luffy would head off and leave Shell's town, this is where Zoro would then ask Luffy if he could join his Marine forces, as he ends up announcing to Luffy about his wish to become the world's greatest swordsman. And he ends up explaining to Luffy about how he feels as if he were to go with Luffy, he would definitely be able to attain that dream of his. Now Luffy, after hearing Zoro's dream and the reason why he wants to join him, he would actually allow Zoro to come along, as he truly senses Zoro's potential. And not only that, but he can honestly see that already by this point, Zoro was most definitely strong enough to join his forces, especially with the way he's able to contend. As even though he basically did nothing when it came to facing off against Luffy, he most definitely could give a Marine captain a good fight. As if Zoro faced off against a Marine captain that was not someone like Smoker, he would most definitely give them a run for their money. So with that, we end up seeing Zoro then join up with Luffy when it comes to the forces, as that would be the end for Shell's Town. Now if you're wondering about, what's going to happen to the Marine base over there, thanks to Luffy being there and after realizing that someone's going to have to fill in Morgan's position, Luffy decided to contact the Marines to let them know about it, explaining about Morgan's capturing and basically his whole expulsion out of the forces, while also explaining that the people need help, causing the Marines to now send more Marines over there to Shell's Town, bringing an end to the Romance Dawn arc and allowing us to move on to Orange Town. Now for the events that happen at Orange Town, we see them first kick off with Luffy, Zoro, as well as Kobe now arriving at, the town itself, and when they do end up arriving, they will then encounter a bunch of pirates chasing away a girl, as this girl would then be revealed to be Nami, as she ends up running past Luffy, telling him thanks as she would then try running away, with Luffy then suddenly grabbing her and preventing her from escaping. As just like that, the men would then end up arriving, threatening Luffy to hand her over, to which Luffy then tells them to calm down, as it was time for them to have a civil chat. But the pirates were hearing none of it. As two caught up in their own anger, they would then try hitting at Luffy, only for Zoro to then intervene, stating that none of them were going to lay a hand on his captain. and when they see Zoro, this will cause them to pale. But then one of them sees Luffy and immediately pales even further, as this when he then begins to mutter to the rest of them about who they're messing with. And when Nami ends up hearing this, she is actually very surprised, as the pirates will then run away apologizing as they rush as quickly as possible. Although Nami will be there, she couldn't believe that she literally tried to get a Marine in trouble, especially such a high ranking one. And not only that, but to hear the pirate hunter was right next to him was terrifying. As just as she was thinking about this is when suddenly both of them would then turn their attention onto her, and realizing that Luffy was still grabbing onto her, this would cause Nami to immediately pale, as she would then tell them that they can talk about this, as we now cut scenes. Now in the next few moments, we will see Nami as she will be there treating the entire group to some food, as she would try her best to kind of let her go with a slap on the wrist, and tries to explain her whole situation about her trying to get away, and she thought that they were going to help her out pretty much. Basically trying to, make it to where she goes out scot-free. And Luffy would just be there listening to everything until suddenly they'll then be cut off by an explosion. Now this would cause Luffy's eyes to narrow, as this is when the entire group would then run out except for Luffy, as he would then end up seeing that the very marine ship that they had was actually almost nearly destroyed completely after a powerful buggy ball. Now this would surprise them, as just like that, Luffy would then end up walking out as he sees the damage onto his ship, and immediately he then sighs out of annoyance, as he then says that he's gonna have to pay a little clown a visit. Now Zoro, after hearing this, would then nod his head in agreement, as he then begins to follow his captain, with Kobe doing the same thing. As even though he's fearing for his life, but at the same time he knows that as a marine he has to toughen up, and that means he has to encounter dangerous pirates regardless of how strong they are. So with that, we see Kobe, Zoro, as well as Luffy now rushing over to the buggy pirates in order to teach them a lesson. And Nami would be there, she can't help but think that they were insane, but after realizing the rumors about Luffy and exactly what he's capable of, she would then follow along to see exactly if all those rumors were true. Now, turning our attention to Buggy, we will see him as he ends up seeing all the destruction he caused, but seeing the marine ship still standing, he ends up cursing for his aim, as he ends up telling them to then ready up another one. Now the men would agree as they begin preparing another buggy ball, preparing to destroy the marine ship in order to teach him a lesson, but just as of course Buggy was doing this is when his men would then come back, letting him know about who exactly had arrived here, were precisely Pirate Hunter Zoro, but the other name is what shook Buggy to his core, as they end up letting Buggy know that the Bloodhound of the Marines had arrived, and this would cause him to pale, as he had heard stories about what the man was capable of, as every single pirate that had encountered this man was captured and brutally taken to the Marines, some of them alive and some of them, if not most of them, were dead. So to hear the fact that he was here now would cause Buggy to immediately pale, as he just realized whose ship he attacked. Now he tries to collect himself, thinking that there's no way that he knows it was him, but right before he could really think about this is when suddenly all he heard was a ginormous explosion, as he feels his ship then be pushed back. As Buggy then turns to the side to see then arriving from the smoke will be none other than Luffy, Zoro, and Kobe, as they have finally arrived. Now immediately this will cause the rest of the pirates there to immediately pale, with Buggy being the palest of them all, before suddenly he then tells his men to fire the buggy ball, as the men would then suddenly turn the cannon onto Luffy and shoot at him. Now Zoro, seeing this, would then panic as he tries to push Luffy out of the way, with Kobe doing the same thing. And Luffy, seeing this, would actually smile as he can't help but appreciate their loyalty, but this is when suddenly he ends up dodging out of the way of their attempts of trying to push him aside, as this is when suddenly he would then suddenly shoot out his hand upward before releasing an unknown force. As just like that, right when the buggy ball would then explode, by the time the smoke would then clear, they would then see that all the damage the buggy ball had caused had basically been zero, as basically the only thing that got damaged was the surrounding area, but nothing to Luffy, Kobe, and Zoro. Now the rest of the crew members would be their shock, as they had no idea that there was someone out there that can resist the power of a buggy ball, but Buggy himself, he will be even more paled, as he just thinks in his head, no way, no way, no way, someone in the East Blue? Why is he in the East Blue? Why is Haki in the East Blue? As he knows exactly what Luffy had done. He had used Haki to literally stop the attack from doing any damage to him or his crewmates. And this will cause Buggy to feel terror, as this is when he then realizes that he has no chance against Luffy. So with that thought in mind, this is when he would then try to make his escape, telling his crew to keep him off his back so that way he can get away, to which they would try to do so for their captain. But Zoro, seeing the opportunity, would then begin cooking the rest of Buggy's crew, as Luffy would just be there reading a book, as Kobe would try to help out as well. But you see, as Buggy was making his escape, as he ends up running away from the rest of his crew and everything, this is when, as he ends up turning the corner, This is when he would then be surprised as someone grabs onto his neck. As Buggy will be there, choking and everything as he tries to pry away the person that was grabbing onto his throat. This is when he would then take a good look at the person, only to be surprised to see none other than Luffy. As Luffy would be there still reading his book with one hand while choking Buggy out with the other one, as he tells Buggy that he just simply was too slow. Now Buggy would be there as he tries his best to escape from Luffy, but nothing was working. His vision was fading as he would then try using blades to stab Luffy, but as soon as he sends out the attack, the Haki would then stop them, as the blades would then bend after contact. As Buggy would be there choking and everything, this is when he can do nothing more but curse out the Marine before finally falling into unconsciousness. As just like that, Luffy had stopped Buggy quite easily. As now with Buggy defeated, and after both Kobe and Zoro had taken a complete massacre to Buggy's crew, this would be basically the end of the Orangetown arc. As by this point now, the villagers would be informed about the events that happened, and they'll be incredibly grateful to Luffy. And Luffy, if you're wondering what he was doing, he was currently right now turning Buggy in, as well as the rest of his crew, while also calling up the Marines to send some forces to this village, as this village had zero protection whatsoever, allowing for Buggy to easily gain access to it. So if they continued on with no protection at all, then most likely another pirate was going to do the same thing. So Luffy made sure to think beforehand. And the person to watch all this happen would be Nami, as she'll be amazed by what the group had been able to accomplish, as she was so surprised about how strong they were. Even Kobe, who so far from what she's seen, he was not really that much of a trained Marine yet, but still nonetheless he was able to put up a good fight against the Buggy pirate, as he was still able to continue on fighting even after getting banged up pretty badly. So this will cause her respect for them to immediately increase, but also cause her to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they'll be able to assist her with her situation. As after all, now that she finally understood who Luffy was, and also with Zoro there assisting him, she realized that these guys were completely different from other Marines that she had seen before, as most of them were very arrogant, very cocky, and overall just didn't seem to have the power to back up their words. But these guys were on a completely different level. As after thinking about it for a while, this is where Nami would then approach Luffy, asking him if she can tag along for a little while, as she would end up making a bullshit reason, stating that the reason why she wants to tag along is because of the fact that she's been wondering if she could join the Marines or not, and she wanted to see first-hand experience about what it's like to be a Marine. And when Luffy ends up hearing this reason, he immediately can tell that that was all bullshit, but still regardless would let Nami join them for a little while. And the main reason for this is because of the fact that Luffy could tell that there's something was up with Nami, as just the way that she acted, it just all seemed too ungenuine. Although for a very brief instance there were times where she was serious about things, just based off that interaction alone, Luffy's able to pretty much connect some details here and there, and he's able to pretty much tell exactly that there's something going on with Nami, or there's a situation that she's involved in. For what it is, he's still unsure about, but sooner or later he can definitely put all the details together to figure it out himself. But still, regardless of all that, this is where we have Nami unofficially join Luffy's forces. As now with this being said, this is where we now continue on with the story, and I hope you guys don't mind, but I'm going to be skimming forward with a lot of stuff, mostly because of the fact that most of the events that happen at the East Blue Saga play out pretty similar to the main timeline, with the outcomes mostly remaining the same, as we now continue forward. So moving on, as we end up turning to Zero Village briefly, we end up seeing the events that play out there happening pretty similar to the main timeline, as the only reason why Luffy and his group stopped there is because of the fact that they need resources, to which they end up getting them after defeating the Black Cat Pirates, and more precisely Kudo. A little bit of a small note here, we actually find out that Luffy did nothing during this entirety of this arc, as he wants to let his new crew members actually grow in power and face their own troubles without relying on him too much, as the only time that Luffy would truly intervene is if their life was truly in danger. So with that, we will see mostly Kobe and Zoro take care of the whole problem, and this will cause Nami's respect for Luffy as well as Zoro and Kobe to skyrocket even further. And by the end of the arc, we actually end up seeing that Luffy and the rest of his crew end up heading out, continuing on with their journey, with the only exception here being the fact that Usopp does not join them, unfortunately. And the main reason why, before you guys get all upset, is because of the fact that Usopp wants to become a pirate, and Luffy is a Marine. So with that, Usopp apologizes for not being able to join them, to which Luffy of course tells him to be okay, and also not to cause any trouble or else he's gonna catch him, to which Usopp just chuckles awkwardly before nodding his head. So with that, we see Usopp then go on his own journey out to sea in order to become his own man, to which that would most definitely be a very interesting story as we now continue on. Now for the Baratie, we see things play out once again similar to the main timeline there, as eventually they end up stopping there once again to collect some supplies. But as they were there, they then encounter another Marine who tries to kind of, flex his authority over the other ones, but unfortunately fails miserably in the presence of Luffy, causing him to be very upset, but has no choice but to escape the area, considering the fact that he doesn't want to get into any more trouble. So with that, Luffy and the rest of his group just stayed there until Dawn Creek would then end up arriving, and sooner or later Dracula Mihawk. Thankfully though, Luffy's forces were able to take care of all of them for the most part, except for Mihawk, as he was just on a completely different level, so strong in fact that Luffy actually had to intervene. As right as it seemed as if Zoro was actually, dying and everything, and he was actually about to die to Dracula Mihawk, Luffy was able to intervene at the very last second, stopping Mihawk's slash and surprising everyone that was there, as Luffy then tells them to calm down and that they can settle this at another time, while also telling Zoro that this was nothing more but a glimpse about what the world truly has to offer. And this will cause Zoro to gain a newfound determination, as he then vows to Luffy, stating that he will never lose again and that he will one day become the world's strongest and greatest swordsman, to which Luffy then tells him that he's going to hold him up to that promise. As soon afterwards, Dracula Mihawk then continues on with his own adventures, although he does make sure to remember Zoro's name as the one who could potentially surpass him, causing him to have a faint smile on his face as he ends up leaving. Now soon afterwards, the Baratie has to of course be patched up, as Dawn Creek will end up getting a bunch of Marines arriving on the scene to capture him and send him away, as Luffy and his crew will try to help out when it comes to fixing up the Baratie. And you see, during the time that they were fixing up the Baratie, we would actually see Sanji slowly but surely connect with every last one of them, as he ends up having a fond connection with every last one of them, so fond in fact that Zeph was able to notice all of this, as this would eventually end up leading to Zeph asking Luffy and the rest of his forces to take Sanji, as he ends up stating the reason behind it, to which of course Sanji gets mad, only to find out that the reason that he gave Luffy was a lie, as the truth is, he believed that Sanji had so much potential that he shouldn't be tied down to the Baratie, and every other cook would actually agree with this, causing Sanji to cry, as he ends up thanking all of them before asking Luffy if he can join him in the Marines. To which Luffy, after hearing this, would then agree to it, telling Sanji that it's going to be a heck of an adventure and that they're not going to be staying in one place, to which Sanji was all there for it, as he wants to venture out to see the All Blue for himself. So with that, this is where we end up having Sanji officially join Luffy's forces, as we now end up heading to the Arlong Park arc. Now already the very beginning of this arc plays out completely different from the main timeline, as Nami would ask Luffy for his help instead of actually, taking the ship and heading off on her own. As after seeing Luffy and the rest of his crew's strength, this is when Nami believes that she can fully put her faith in them in helping her out of her situation. And Luffy, after hearing this, would agree to it, as Nami begins to detail him about Arlong Park and more precisely about Arlong. Now this will cause everyone to get angry, as Luffy, with a very cold tone, would then tell her to take him to him, to which she would do so as she begins to navigate the marine ship to where Arlong Park was. And after traversing through the seas and encountering a ginormous Sea King, eventually they were able to arrive there, as Luffy ends up casually pulling up to the front door. Now Nami, seeing this, would try to argue against it, but this is when Luffy then calmly tells her that this is her home, and that she should have the right to walk through her front door regardless of what someone else wants. As just like that, this is where we would then see Luffy, for the first time ever, displaying true anger. He would then burst open the gates of Arlong Park and actually make his way in there like he owns the place, catching the attention of all the fishmen, as the rest of the crew would then ready up for battle. Now when Arlong looks at Luffy, he then immediately realizes who it is, as after all, unlike the rest of his, foolish crewmates, he already knows exactly who Luffy is. He's kept up to date on the newspapers. So realizing exactly that the Bloodhound of the Marines was now here would cause him to pale immediately, as this is when he would then try to, talk his way out of the situation, asking Luffy exactly what is he doing here and if he could offer him anything, to which Luffy just calmly tells him that by orders of the Marines, Arlong has been sentenced to go to jail, whether he likes it or not, and he will be taken in whether alive or dead. As Luffy would say this with a very professional and cold tone, causing Arlong to immediately feel a shiver go down his spine, as he then orders his fishmen to attack, which ends up leading to an all-out battle between Luffy's crew and Arlong's forces, to which Zoro was able to pick up the slack immediately, as even after the injuries he had gotten from Mihawk, he was still able to put up a very good fight, defeating the fishmen pirates like they were nothing, with Sanji doing the same thing, and even Kobe putting up a better fight. As Nami would be there watching everything amazed, as Luffy would be the one to be bombarded by most of the fishmen, but to her absolute surprise, they were never able to touch him, as the second that all of them would surround Luffy, immediately they would just fall into unconsciousness without even reaching him once, as Luffy would then calmly approach Arlong before getting right into his face. Now Arlong seeing this would then get angry as he tries to throw a punch at Luffy, only to then suddenly be blasted away, crashing into the very tower that he had Nami stuck in for many years. As we would see Arlong trying his best to shake off the injury as he tries to get back into the fight, all the while Luffy would just be there looking at the tower as suddenly something fallen from there. As suddenly landing right in front of Luffy would be none other than one of the drawings that Nami had made. And Luffy, just looking at it, he's able to sense something with his enhanced senses, as he's able to smell the scent of blood. And this made Luffy extremely angry, as in the very next minute, this is when everyone around can just hear nothing more but Arlong screaming, as well as the sound of some bones breaking. As suddenly they will then see Arlong then be tossed out of there so quick that none of them are able to react, as he ends up slamming hard against the walls of Arlong Park, causing it to tear down and causing many of the villagers that were now arriving to see what was happening to take a good look. As to everyone's horror, they will see Arlong as he'll be mangled beyond belief. The man would look like he was literally on death's door. As we end up seeing Luffy then walk out of the tower, as we would then see it then collapse down to the ground, as he ends up approaching Arlong with a cold look, as he was now ready to finish it. Now Arlong tries his best to escape from Luffy, as he then orders the people that were there, saying that as their king right now, that they should help him. But unfortunately, none of the villagers were going to help him at all, as instead they all begin to slowly look away, with some of them gladly looking at Arlong with a disgusted look. Now Arlong couldn't believe this as he tries to call out for his crewmates, only to see that every last one of them had been taken care of. As this made Arlong realize that this was his fate now. He would try to crawl away with his broken body, but unfortunately it doesn't work out. As right before he could get away, Luffy would then grab him by the neck and raise him up into the air, as Arlong would be struggling to get out of his grasp, but unfortunately his body was way too broken to do anything. As the only thing Arlong can really do was simply curse Luffy's name, as Luffy would then tell Arlong that he would see him on the other side. As with one swift motion, all they would hear is a ginormous snap, as Arlong's body would then go limp. As just like that, Arlong would have passed away, as Luffy had defeated him swiftly, with no hint of mercy at all. As Nami would be there watching the entire thing, showing in a very emotionless expression, as she did not care for Arlong's fate at all, as in her eyes he deserved it. But this is when suddenly she would then begin to break down crying, as she finally realized that after so many years, that she was finally free from Arlong's clutches. But you see, she was not the only one that was crying, as suddenly many villagers there would then begin to break down, as they suddenly begin to cheer for Luffy, as they thank him for finally getting rid of Arlong. And as for the rest of the fishmen, they would get away as quickly as possible, moving their broken bodies away from Luffy and the rest of his crew, not wanting to mix up with them, as many of them are cursing for the death of Arlong, but unfortunately there was nothing they could do, as they can simply do nothing more but swim away and hope and pray that they can never encounter the bloodhound of the Marines. As now with Arlong Park officially over, and after one little brief party, this is where we would then see Luffy and the rest of his forces then get ready to set sail to sea, until suddenly Nami would then approach them and ask them if she can join them. As after all, she was incredibly grateful to Luffy, and not only that, but she actually wanted to draw a map of the entire world. But that was not the only thing. And it's because of the fact that she also got a hidden drive to actually make sure that something like that never happens to anyone else ever again, as she didn't want a simple girl or boy or whoever was in a similar situation to her to have to go through the same thing that she did. And Luffy, after seeing her resolve and seeing that she was not taking no for an answer, this is when he would then agree to it, as now Nami would officially join Luffy's forces, as this is where we would then begin to see his journey as he prepares to head off to the Grand Line, as now the Bloodhound of the Marines was now officially back on duty. Yeah, that's right, everything that Luffy did throughout this entire time, technically he had been off duty, but now he was back at it once again. As we now end up seeing Luffy and the rest of his crew now head off to Loguetown, as that was the very last stop that Luffy needed for his trip to the Grand Line. Now when Luffy arrives at Loguetown, immediately he is welcomed by the Marines that were there, and more precisely he'll be welcomed by Smoker. Now you see, Luffy and Smoker's interaction were actually pretty chill most of the time, as the truth is the two of them were pretty good friends, as both of them would chill most of the time and would spend half their time just focusing on their sense of duties, making sure to accomplish them without too much difficulties. So due to that, both Smoker as well as Luffy became pretty good friends over time. In either way, after Luffy ended up arriving at Loguetown after meeting up with Smoker, this is when Luffy then announces that he's getting back on duty, and also announcing that the rest of the people that were following him were the ones that were going to join the Marines. And when Smoker heard this, he simply nodded his head in understanding, as this is when suddenly he would then tell Luffy about everything being prepared and letting him know that everything is fully set for him to take off, to which he ends up thanking Smoker. Now the rest of Luffy's crew, they'll be quickly accustomed, as this is when the Marines that were there at Loguetown would then suddenly give them uniforms in order to make them look more like Marines. And soon afterwards, after they're all fully fitted and everything, this is when suddenly they would then actually approach Luffy, who was now waiting at the dock, and when they would arrive, they would see a ginormous Vice Admiral ship, as they'll see it just simply parked at the dock, with many people just gasping in shock to see something like that here at Loguetown. As you see, Luffy had stationed his ship that he usually used to go to the Grand Line right here at Loguetown, since he knew that Smoker would look after it. To which he most definitely did, as already Luffy could tell that the ship was way cleaner than last time he had seen it. To which he ends up thanking Smoker for it, to which he tells him it was no problem. As just like that, this is where we would then see Luffy then enter his ship, as soon following along will be none other than the rest of the crew, who are now fully decked out in marine attire. As they would then begin to approach the ship, only to then realize that this was it. Right here, right now will be the very beginning of them heading off to the Grand Line and facing off with even more bigger enemies and going on bigger adventures. As every last one of them would actually shudder in excitement, this is where we would then see them take their first step on their journey of a lifetime. As now with this being completed, this is where we now turn to the very adventures that end up happening at the Grand Line and even further beyond, as we now continue on with the story. So turning to the events that end up happening at the Grand Line, we see Luffy and his crew mostly going on different journeys and different adventures, but mostly because of these two reasons. Either A, because of resources, as sometimes during the adventures, Luffy and his crew will end up lacking resources, which causes Luffy and the rest of them to then make a stop here and there at different islands to where they would then encounter threats. And the second reason will be due to the fact of missions sent by the Marines, as after all, now that Luffy was back on duty, he had to accomplish them. With the newest one being the fact that Luffy had to hunt down Crocodile, as they had suspected that he had been, thinking about betraying his status as a warlord, and they needed to put a fix in that immediately. So with that, Luffy and the rest of his crew then decided to do so, as after going to Alabasta and after traversing Reverse Mountain, they would then arrive at Whiskey Peak, to which Luffy, or more precisely the rest of his crew, ended up taking care of the rest of all of the people that were working for Brookworks, and more precisely the ones that were working for Crocodile. And after realizing that, Luffy was the Vice Admiral and realizing that he was the Bloodhound of the Marines, Vivi would then reveal herself as she would then ask Luffy's assistance to save Alabasta, to which he ends up accepting it, as after all, this was his mission. So due to that, Vivi ends up accompanying Luffy and the rest of his crew as they end up traversing the rest of Alabasta. And during their time there, they would encounter many different threats from Brookworks employees that were working for Crocodile, as Crocodile during this time would send more enemies than he did in the main timeline, with the main reason behind this being the fact that Crocodile was most definitely afraid of Luffy, as after all, he heard the stories about the man and even seen images that were printed out on the newspapers, as he sees what Luffy does to certain victims depending on the crime, and he most definitely felt unsure about what exactly Luffy would do to him after hearing about all the crimes that Crocodile had committed. So due to that, Crocodile was already thinking about how to slow down Luffy, and if things had gone into an even worse position, he already thought about ways to flee the country if needed. But you see, the person who was actually most afraid of Luffy during this time was not Crocodile. No, in fact, it was Robin, who is now currently going by the moniker of Miss All Sunday. As you see, the thing is, Luffy being a Vice Admiral and being known as the Bloodhound of the Marines, it spooked her considering the fact that she wasn't 100% sure that she could get away from Luffy, as after all, he was a Vice Admiral, and not only that, but once again, Bloodhound of the Marines. He was known for hunting down people like her. So due to that, she was very much deeply afraid of him and was already thinking about ways to betray Crocodile and leave as quickly as possible. But still, regardless of all that, this is where we now turn back to Luffy, as we see him make a couple more stops during his journey of Alabasta, as he ends up stopping at Drum Island, where he ends up encountering a very own doctor for the ship, this being none other than Chopper. As you see, the thing is, once again, things will play out pretty similar to the main timeline here, with the main difference here being the fact that Wapol does not actually come back to, Drum Island to reclaim his, kingdom and everything like that. With the main reason why is because of the fact that Wapol knew about Luffy. And the thing is, Wapol was a coward. There was no way he was actually going to face off against Luffy, especially going by such a scary moniker. There was no way he was going to even touch that. So with that, Wapol just simply decides to let Luffy have the country and just leave. There was no way he was going to have any type of smoke with that man. But still, regardless of that though, Luffy ends up stopping at Drum Island and soon ends up befriending Chopper after he heals up Nami after she caught a sickness. And after Chopper befriends the rest of Luffy's crew, this is when he would then ask Luffy if he can join him, to which he ends up accepting this. Now soon afterwards, and after saying a very tearful goodbye to Kureha, eventually Chopper ends up joining them as they would then eventually arrive at Alabasta. Now during this time at Alabasta, Luffy and the rest of his crew encounter many different types of threats. Mostly Brookworks employees that were trying to stop them from getting to Crocodile, but failing miserably. Now along the way, Luffy, as he was actually moving around, just simply letting his crew deal with all the problems, this is when he would then suddenly end up encountering none other than his brother Ace. Which Ace in this timeline is actually way more infamous, mostly because of the fact that Ace in this timeline had gotten training from Luffy, making him much more of a dangerous threat. And when Luffy and Ace see each other, instead of actually saying hello and everything like that, they just immediately begin fighting each other. But you see, the thing is, neither of them were taking it very seriously, as they were just laughing as they continued trading blows with each other, causing a generous amount of damage. As after, fighting for a little bit, they would then begin to catch up with each other, as Ace begins to actually ask Luffy if he could become a pirate, saying that Luffy definitely has the potential for it. But once again, Luffy tells him that he's not going to do that anytime soon, saying that he just simply does not have the energy to become a pirate. Now, Ace hearing this once again sighs in disappointment, but understands and respects Luffy's choices. But soon afterwards, this is when Luffy would then give Ace the heads up to leave, as he would then let Ace know to not do anything bad or else he's going to capture him, which causes Ace to laugh as he tells Luffy good luck with that, letting him know that the next time they fight he's going to win. As just like that, we then see Ace then leave Alabasta, as Luffy would then return back to his crew. And once again, after traversing and defeating more and more Crocodile's Brookworks, employees, eventually they would then arrive at Crocodile's location, just as Crocodile was about to flee the country. Now this ends up causing a battle to immediately break out, as Crocodile would then cause a ginormous sand tornado to appear, using it to blind Luffy and the rest of his crew as he then tries to make his getaway. Now during that time Crocodile was trying to get away, he would then look around for Robin, wondering where she went, only to realize that she betrayed him, causing him to then get very angry. But before he can get too angry, this is when suddenly he would then get speared right in the midst of flying in the air, thanks to him being, a Sandman, as he ends up crashing to the ground very hard. Now as he tries to collect himself and get back to breathing correctly, this is when suddenly he would then be barraged by blows by none other than Luffy, as Luffy had been not at all fazed by the ginormous sand tornado. Now this ends up turning to a battle between Luffy and Crocodile, and while Crocodile is most definitely strong and is in home territory, unfortunately Luffy's skills were something that Crocodile has never seen in his entire life, as moving so fast that Crocodile can't even react, moving so fast that it surpassed the very speed of the Rokushiki, Luffy had been able to actually blitz Crocodile, as this causes him to realize just how rusty he really had gotten and just how lazy he had become. But that didn't mean he was going to give up, as this is when he would then try to bury Luffy in a sand tomb. As we end up seeing Luffy then get stuck in this ginormous temple, this is where Crocodile would then try to crush Luffy within it, trying to put an end to him. But right as he was thinking that victory was in his grasp, this is when suddenly shooting out of the ginormous sand temple would be none other than a ginormous spear of water that ends up piercing Crocodile through the shoulder, causing him to bleed and also causing him to gain solid form. As he ends up gritting his teeth from the pain, this is when Luffy would then walk out of there, with Crocodile just asking Luffy how he was able to do that, and asking him if he ate a devil fruit. To which Luffy, after hearing this, then says nothing more, as he then grabs the spear before twisting it, causing Crocodile to scream out in pain, as Luffy then calmly tells him no. As Crocodile, after hearing that, just couldn't believe it, but before he could do anything else, this is when Luffy would then suddenly neck chop him, telling Crocodile that he lost. As just like that, Crocodile would then go down, and this would end up causing the rest of Alabasta to then be free. As soon afterwards, Vivi would then announce a speech announcing about the whole problem and what truly went down, realizing exactly that Crocodile was behind all of this would cause everyone to then immediately turn against him, and soon afterwards Marines would then arrive onto the scene to turn in Crocodile. Now as a thanks for doing his service, Luffy would be given a generous reward along with the rest of his crew, as every last one of them would gain a generous pile of money, but that was not the only thing, as Luffy would be given even more subordinates, mostly because of the fact that as a Vice Admiral, Luffy should have more people working under him, or at least that's how the Marines view it. And although Luffy did not want more paperwork and more people to control, eventually he had no choice but to accept it, as just like that, more Marine subordinates would arrive on Luffy's ship, working hard to serve underneath him. with Luffy's crew actually turning out to be vice members of Luffy's, well, station actually. Even though Luffy had more people working for him for much longer, they were the ones that were there with him for much longer periods of time than most people, which is surprising since they only been with Luffy for basically now an entire month, and that was it. So yeah, definitely shocking. But still, nonetheless, now that they went ahead and taken care of Alabasta, this is where we now continue on with the story as we end up seeing Luffy and the rest of his now growing forces continue on in more adventures. As the very next island that they will be visiting will be the island of Jaya, as we now enter into the Skypiea saga. To which, starting right now, I'm really sorry to everyone, but I'm gonna have to skim forward through a large amount of this saga, with the main reason why is because of the fact that Luffy and his crew have a very much more easier time when it comes to dealing with it. Because if you guys didn't know about this, by this point, after the events that happened at the Alabasta saga, Luffy had begun training up his crew, as he wanted to make sure that these guys were strong enough to face off against the bigger threats that were now going to be arriving at the Grand Line very soon. As he knew that right past Alabasta, the greater threats were going to soon arrive, and those would be during the times that Luffy would actually have to begin taking things more seriously. Not serious enough to the point where he has to go all out, but serious enough where he may actually have begun, pulling out a little bit more trump cards than he had intended. But still, nonetheless, Luffy and the rest of his crew were stronger than their canon counterpart, making them blow past this part of the story relatively easily. As just based off their arrival alone at Jaya, you could already see a very big difference, as thanks to Luffy's, just reputation of being the, bloodhound of the Marines, many pirates that were there immediately left the island, not wanting any smoke with him at all. Which was okay with Luffy, considering the fact that he wasn't here for any smoke, as instead he was looking for information and resources. As they stopped there in order to get some more resources for the ship, but also because of the fact that Luffy had been sent out on another mission, to hunt down Nico Robin, or more precisely to capture her. As you see, after the events that happened at Alabasta, Robin had completely fallen off the grid once again, and once again, the world government had been looking for her, so they decided to send the best man possible, the bloodhound of the Marines himself. And Luffy had been looking for information on Nico Robin. So when he stopped at Jaya, he immediately began asking people that were there, and of course he was unfortunately not able to find out too much except for the fact that she was here for a brief moment before leaving. Now this would cause Luffy to get annoyed, but still regardless of that, he would thank them for their assistance before heading off to continue looking for Nico Robin. And along the time as Luffy was leaving the island, he would actually end up having a brief encounter with Blackbeard. But the thing is, just to make sure you guys have some key details on this, number one, Blackbeard was hiding his appearance, and the main reason why is because of the fact that he knows of Luffy's reputation, and he knows that currently right now, he was just simply no match for Luffy at this very moment. He could just sense it. But the thing is, the interaction between the two of them was honestly, even though it was very brief, it was very interesting. As while Blackbeard felt a genuine amount of fear, Luffy had been able to sense something else entirely, as he had been able to sense more than one presence when it came to Blackbeard. And this will cause him to raise his eye, but still regardless of that, he'll continue on walking, as that was the only exchange that happened between Blackbeard and Luffy. As soon afterwards, Luffy would then continue on with his journey, before eventually him and his crew would then actually end up heading off to Sky Island. And you see, the main reason why Luffy and his crew go there is because of the fact that Luffy actually had to go retrieve something for the world government, as after all, there was a certain information about Sky Island that was hidden from most of the public that Luffy had to hunt down. And if you guys are still wondering what I'm talking about the polyglyphs, as Luffy had been tasked with the responsibility to actually, make sure to hide that information away. So after going up into Sky Island, Luffy and his crew would then go there, and soon end up meeting the Sky people and basically the natives there, as the rest of the arc will play out very, very similar to the main timeline, with Luffy's main role on all of this just simply going around and looking for the polyglyphs, so that way he can dispose of them while also getting the information and taking it back to the world government. But while Luffy was doing this, however, this is when suddenly, to his very surprise, he would then be approached by none other than Enel. As you see, Enel had basically wreaked havoc on Luffy's crew, and I mean a large amount of havoc. As although they were very strong, as many of the crew had been able to last for a very long time, Enel had been able to wipe all of them since they were not able to do hockey. Although I should let you guys know about this though, Zoro had been able to put up the very best fight when it came to facing off against Enel, and the main reason why is because of the fact for a very brief instance, Enel had been able to actually feel himself getting in danger when it came to facing off against Zoro. As even though he knew for sure that his body was made of lightning, he felt as if that if he were to let Zoro attack him right there at that very instance, that he could potentially get injured. as unknowingly to Zoro was the fact that he was getting closer and closer to awakening his haki. But regardless of that though, turning back to Luffy and Enel, we will then see a very interesting fight then break off between the two of them, as Enel tries to teach Luffy his place in the world, only for Luffy to then casually deflect the lightning like it was nothing. As to Enel's surprise, Luffy would then calmly generate his own lightning, telling Enel if that little party trick was supposed to impress him. Now this will end up leading to the battle between Luffy and Enel, which ends up actually shaking up the entirety of Sky Island, as people all around would then see the chaotic battle, as they will see a ginormous, thunder dragon that will be rushing at Luffy, with Luffy sending a ginormous fireball. As to them, they just see a ginormous amount of lightning and fire, wind, and a bunch of other stuff just mixing up into the entire sky, looking as if two divine beings were going at it. Now Luffy and Enel's fight would go on for quite a while before eventually it would then end with one last collision, as we see Enel enter into his ginormous form as he tries to strike down Luffy with that ginormous thunder fist, with Luffy then rushing at Enel. But this went to Enel's surprise, Luffy would then generate a ginormous amount of lightning into the palm of his hands, as this will be none other than Kakashi's one signature technique, Lightning Blade. But you see, the thing is, he had not been able to use it before in his old life after he lost a Sharingan. But here he had conquered his haki to compensate for it. As now removing the tunnel vision, this is where we then end up seeing Kakashi, or should I say Luffy, then landing a powerful attack into Enel's chest. And infusing it with haki, this is where we would actually see something interesting, as the once blue and white electricity that urged from the lightning blade had completely changed to much more of a black and red color as it entered Enel's chest, as Luffy was adding haki into it. As Enel would be screaming out in pain before eventually he would then collapse down to the ground, as right then and there, the god Enel had truly fallen to the bloodhound of the Marines. As just like that, this is where we will end up seeing the people of Sky Island then begin to cheer, as Enel's reign of terror has been over. As now that the rest of Sky Island have been freed from Enel, this is where we're now able to continue on with the story. As now that Enel had been defeated, and more precisely now that he had been killed by Luffy, this would cause Luffy and his crew to actually be able to leave Skypiea. But the thing is, the people there felt so grateful towards them that they actually gave them a generous amount of treasure, which made Nami especially happy that she joined the Marines, or more precisely that she felt very happy that she joined Luffy. As soon afterwards, this is where we end up seeing Luffy as well as the rest of his forces then leave Skypiea, as this is where we then enter into the Water 7 saga. Now for the events that end up happening here, we're going to see something very different actually occur from the main timeline. As you see, when Luffy and his crew actually end up arriving there, or more precisely, kind of the gateway entry point of Water 7, they will then encounter a small miniature island, to which they decide to take a small little stop there. But when they're there, this is when suddenly a ginormous sea king would then try to attack the island, which causes Luffy and the rest of his crew to try to, move into action. But before they can do anything, this is when suddenly that entire Sea King would then be frozen by one individual. And Luffy, when he sees him, this is when suddenly he then cracks actually a wide smile underneath his mask, as suddenly almost teleporting from his place, Luffy would then appear behind the individual and give him a nice sharp kick directly into the head, powering him into the ground. Now this will cause everyone to look at Luffy as if he was insane, but this is when suddenly rising up from the ground would be none other than Aokiji, as he would actually be bleeding a little bit from the back of his head, as he would then begin to try to tough out through the pain and simply tell Luffy that his attack was really weak, which caused Luffy to immediately tell him that that was false, as the two of them begin to go into a playful banter. As you see, the thing is, Aokiji had decided to play much more of a kind of older brother figure in Luffy's life, and by that I mean he's been with Luffy the longest, and I'm talking about even longer than both Ace and Sabo, surprisingly. As if you guys remember the Admiral that gave Luffy the captain ranking, this will be the one who had done it, Aokiji. And not only that, but he had also been the one to be there for when Luffy became a Vice Admiral. And whenever Luffy went on missions occasionally, or whenever he was training with Garp, Aokiji had been most of the time there, allowing for the two of them to bond. Which is why the events that were happening now were happening in the first place. As we end up seeing both Aokiji and Luffy catch up with each other as they begin discussing about the missions that they've been on, with of course the rest of the crew being fascinated with the fact of just how much influence their captain has, as well as all the connections. This is when eventually Aokiji would then have to leave before letting Luffy know about the fact that there was a sighting of Nico Robin in these areas, which ends up causing Luffy to narrow his eyes, as soon afterwards we will then see Aokiji then leave the island, waving Luffy goodbye before realizing that he forgot to tell Luffy one more thing, before eventually shrugging, already knowing that someone else was going to tell Luffy about it. As soon afterwards, this is where we then have the events of the Water 7 saga just kicking off, as Luffy and his crew would then eventually arrive at Water 7, getting a bunch of supplies, and also while at the same time just making sure that their ship was at, top condition, as after all they were Marines, so they got some special treatment. Although Luffy did make sure to pay them secretly. But as they were making sure to, make maintenance on Luffy's ship, this is when suddenly, to Luffy's surprise, this is when he would then begin to actually catch notice of certain individuals in the shipwright group. This being the fact that Luffy begins to notice none other than CP9, an assassination group that was formed by the world government, and Luffy was very much familiar with them, as after all, there was once a point in Luffy's childhood where he had been offered the position of being the new leader of CP9. As you see, there was once a time when Luffy and Rob Lucci had been once competing with each other to become the leader of CP9, but you see, one of them was by choice, the other one was not really by choice, as the competition was held in private, with Luffy just being kept under observation to see exactly if he was willing or fitting to become the leader of CP9, to which a majority of people would agree that Luffy was much more superior than Rob Lucci, but when Luffy was offered the position, he just simply rejected it. As after all, to Kakashi, it just reminded him of the Anbu, except just way better. I mean way better. Kakashi has seen the Anbu being completely ass at one point, and heck, during the time of Boruto, they were basically non-irrelevant at all. They were never there. Hey, in fact, he thought the entire organization got disbanded. But still, regardless of that, Kakashi just didn't simply feel like he should join them, as after all, even though he would be very good at it, he just simply did not want to get even more work than he already has. So with that, Kakashi just simply did not become the leader of CP9, as we now end up turning back to Water 7. Now, during the time of Water 7, of course, Kakashi will be making sure to keep an eye on CP9, wondering what exactly was their objective, while during that time, Kakashi would also be snooping around for any information on Nico Robin, until eventually he would then actually discover her. As you see, Robin by this point had been trying to get out the island as quickly as possible after finding the marine ship that she was all too familiar with. But when she was trying to escape, Luffy had been able to actually corner her, causing her to try to use her devil fruit to escape, only to fail miserably. As moving quicker than she could even react, Luffy had been able to restrain her and keep her from being able to use her devil fruit, allowing for Robin to be effectively captured. Now, seeing that she was captured, she would try to go along with it, fully emotionless and just accepting her fate, but you see, as Luffy begins to take her back to the rest of her crew, to the rest of his crew, this is when she would then begin to actually unknowingly begin to release tears. As this is when she then realizes that she was actually shaking, as she was now feeling true terror. As she realizes that this was the end. This was the end of her entire journey. She didn't get to do too many things in her life, and she wasn't even able to read all the polyglyphs. As we end up seeing Robin actually display true emotion for the very first time in a long time, Luffy seeing this would then sigh, as he already knows that the very next move that he was going to make was going to be probably the most dumbest one, and also the most risky one. As soon afterwards, as Luffy ends up returning back to his crew and everything, and of course bringing on Nico Robin, this is when suddenly CP9 would then also try to intervene as well, as they end up approaching Luffy as well as the rest of his crew, but this time they fully exit out of the full shipwright attire and begin to tell Luffy to hand over Nico Robin, telling Luffy that they were the first one to get the mission to retrieve her back and that Luffy was overstepping his boundaries. And when Luffy heard this, he just casually told them that they had been given the mission first, but he had been the one to complete it the quickest, and he had been the first one to complete it in general. Now this would cause Rob Lucci to get pissed off, as this is when he would then enter into a battle stance. And Luffy seeing this would then sigh, as this is when he would then begin to actually give Rob Lucci the conditions, stating that if he could actually beat Luffy in this fight, then he would gladly, give Robin over to him easily. And Lucci, after hearing this, would then nod his head in agreement, even though the rest of his members would then try to immediately announce their disapproval of it. As after all, this was something that they were not supposed to do. They were supposed to follow protocol. But unfortunately, Lucci, after realizing that, Luffy was supposed to gain that position before him, and also realizing that Luffy was way stronger than him, he just simply could not let that pride go away from him. As after all, his pride had been deeply damaged after finding out about it, and he wanted a little bit of revenge on Luffy. So with that, this is where we end up seeing Luffy face off against Rob Lucci, and unfortunately, Rob Lucci just ends up losing very quickly. As even though he mastered the Rokushiki to a certain extent, Luffy had done the same thing, but even further. as after all, there was a reason why the world government tried to give the position to Luffy first instead of Rob Lucci. And the simple reason for it is because of the fact that Luffy, in every sense of the word, was better than Lucci. As unfortunately, Lucci had lost to Luffy very quickly, as he ends up going down after just a simple collision. Not even getting into a full fight, they just simply have a miniature clash, and that clash was enough to bring Lucci down to his knees and nearly into unconsciousness. As this would end up shocking the rest of CP9 before every single one of them would then enter into a battle stance, preparing to face off against Luffy. And Luffy, in response to all of this, would then casually just pop out his book as he then waits in anticipation, wondering what their next move is. But you see, the thing is, while they were preparing the fight against Luffy, the rest of Luffy's crew was not going to stand idly by and let that happen, as we will end up seeing Kobe, Zoro, Sanji, Chopper, and even Nami all step up, along with the rest of the people that recently joined Luffy's forces, as every last one of them prepared to face off against CP9 if needed. But right before things can go too extreme, this is when suddenly a booming voice would then be heard, as suddenly everyone would then look up into the sky except for Luffy, who ends up immediately getting a tick mark as well as a sigh of annoyance. As this is when suddenly falling from above and landing right between both groups will be none other than Garp himself. As similar to the main timeline, Garp had arrived at Water 7, with the only difference here being the fact that he had arrived here much sooner, as he had came here for certain business. Now, after seeing CP9 and Luffy's group about to face off, this is when Garp immediately calms down the whole situation by basically telling them that since they failed their mission, they were basically off the case immediately after Luffy had caught Nico Robin. Now, this would cause them to be very much surprised, but after realizing that they can't really go against the words of the hero of the Marines, they have no choice but to accept it, as they end up retreating away from Luffy's crew while taking Rob Lucci away. As just like that, all that was left would be Luffy's crew as well as Luffy along with Garp. And speaking of which, as soon as Garp sees Luffy, he would then immediately try punching him with a love fist, to which Luffy then begins to dodge, and then he dodges another one, and then another one. As the banter between the two of them would then pick up, all the while the rest of Luffy's crew just look on at the comedic display with a look of disbelief, really surprised by the attitude of the hero of the Marines. As this is where we now do a quick change of scenes as well as a time skip. As soon afterwards, we will then see Luffy casually sitting down as he ends up discussing with Garp about the plans that he had in mind. And when Garp heard about Luffy's plans, he immediately tried hitting him once again, calling Luffy an idiot and telling him that he has no idea exactly how much paperwork and trouble that Luffy was going to get himself involved in. To which Luffy tells him that he understood, but still nonetheless, he was willing to go through with it. To which Garp would sigh. As you see, after realizing that Robin was basically completely scared for her fate, and also about the fact that how she was truly fearing the idea of death and everything, and also realizing that she wasn't really, doing anything too bad as most other people's did, this is where Luffy then decides to do something quite merciful and decide to take Robin under his wing. But the thing is, if Luffy were to do that, not only was he going to get a large amount of backlash from the Marines, but not only that, but he was going to have to hear the complaints of the world government itself. To which Luffy was willing to hear them out, as basically all he has to do is just sit there while getting bombarded by a bunch of insults. But at the end of the day, Robin would still be under his protection, as long as she doesn't do anything too crazy. So yeah, basically Luffy is Robin's ward. He's going to be looking after her, and basically as long as she's with him, she's okay. And Garp, after hearing all of Luffy's plans, just can't help but simply sigh at his grandson, once again asking him if he was okay with this decision, to which Luffy, with a determined look, just tells him that yeah, as after all, anything that they throw at him he could handle. As after all, if there was anyone in this world that definitely knew how to handle paperwork and a bunch of complaints, it had to be the person that was once Hokage, as Kakashi would remember all the paperwork and all the complaints that he would receive. But still, regardless of that, after taking a good look at Robin, and after seeing just how scared she truly was, Luffy would once again just think that he was okay with the idea, as after all, things could be much worse. So with that, Garp once again sighs, telling Luffy that he's just begging for more trouble in his life, but then he begins laughing as he could already tell that Luffy truly was his grandson. But soon afterwards, after laughing and calming things down while also writing out the report that Luffy was going to send to the higher ups, this is when Garp then tells Luffy that the higher ups actually decided to send him a reward. As thanks to the amount of missions that Luffy was able to do, as well as all the achievements he had been able to succeed in, the world government had decided to send Luffy a little reward. As you see, a mysterious fruit had popped up not that long ago after Luffy had entered Water 7 and stayed there for quite a few days, or should I say quite a few weeks. As this is when Garp would then suddenly pull out a treasure chest, as Luffy would then be given it. Now Luffy looks at Garp with a confused expression, as Garp would then begin to lean back with a smile, telling Luffy that he really doesn't need it, but then again, he should take it while he could, as after all they were offering. Now Luffy would roll his eyes after that, as this is when he would then open it, and to his absolute surprise, this is when he would then see a devil fruit. As the world government would actually decide to give Luffy a devil fruit, as a way to congratulate him for all his success. Now Luffy would be there looking at the fruit, as he begins to read the instructions about what to do and basically just what he should do, as the Marines had decided to send him an entire book about, what exactly the devil fruit is and also exactly how to properly gain the ability. Now Luffy would be there contemplating exactly what he should do, as the reward was given to him, so that meant he was able to do anything with it, so he was wondering if he should just take it for himself or maybe give it away to someone else, or maybe even sell it. But the more times that Luffy would think about it, this is when suddenly he would then feel a strange urge from the fruit itself, almost as if it was calling out to him. And Luffy would sigh, as he could already tell where exactly this was going, but still nonetheless decide to do so. As just like that, we would then see Luffy grab the fruit, as Garp would look on with pure interest, as Luffy would then grab his mask. As Garp would then take a look at it, wondering exactly how did Luffy's face look now, as after all it had been a very long time since he last seen it. But right as Luffy was about to peel off the mask, right as he was about to take a bite out of the fruit, this was suddenly the door would then burst open, as many of the crew members decided to check on Luffy and Garp, causing Garp to turn his attention away and also causing Luffy to be able to take a bite immediately. Now immediately after the taste hits Luffy, he then begins to, immediately curse about the taste and everything. All the while Garp looks at Luffy immediately disappointed, as he had been unable to see Luffy's face completely. But you see, now that Luffy had been in the fruit, this is when suddenly he then gets hit with a ginormous wave of knowledge, as he can do nothing more but open his eyes in complete shock, as the fruit that Luffy had gotten was none other than the lightning fruit, the same fruit that Enel had gotten. As you see, not that long ago after Luffy had killed Enel, the very fruit that Enel had, that, now that Enel was gone, it had resurged not that long ago after Luffy had left Sky Island. It just had emerged on a completely different island, an island that the world government was currently right there investigating. And after encountering the fruit, they decided to take it away for safekeeping. Until eventually there was someone that was actually truly worthy of wielding the fruit's power. And lo and behold, Luffy was just right there waiting for the fruit to come to him. So just like that, we end up having Luffy now gaining the lightning fruit. And Luffy realizing exactly just how busted this fruit was, would just be there, completely having his breath taken away, as Garp would be there just, cursing, as he can't help but believe that his grandson actually ate a devil fruit. He had Haki, what did he need a devil fruit for? But still, regardless of that, Garp congratulates Luffy on his new power-up, as he then ends up leaving. But right before he does, he ends up complimenting Luffy's new crew and telling Luffy that he's doing a very good job of becoming a Marine, while also letting Luffy know that he was proud of him. And Luffy hearing this would actually smile, as he could already tell that even though Garp was most definitely the definition of tough love, he most definitely cared about Luffy. That was the one fact that remained true. But still, regardless of that, now that Luffy had basically completed the rest of the Water 7 saga, and now that, Nico Robin was going to be tagging along with Luffy, although under certain conditions, this is where we're now able to continue on with the story, as we now continue with Luffy's adventure, along with the rest of his, of course, ever-growing crew. As we now end up continuing on with the story. Now you see, the events that end up happening with the rest of the Grand Line, after the events that happened at Water 7, are going to be skimmed forward by a lot. And the main reason why is because of the fact that Luffy doesn't really do too much during these instances, except for training up his crew. As after all, Luffy was already way above them before eating the devil fruit, but now he just so far exceeded them by every single means. As Luffy would train up every single one of his crew, teaching them the Rokushiki, also the fundamentals of Haki, and basically just helping every last one of them grow stronger. Now, Luffy's crew would take this in great stride, but the ones that were really doing it like the most would be Kobe, Zoro, Sanji, Nami, and Chopper, as every last one of them were pushing themselves to the absolute limit. Robin would also be joining in on this one, as she was still very surprised about the fact of her newfound freedom, and she was very appreciative towards Luffy, so she was trying her best to seem useful. But the thing is, thanks to the conditions that were placed on her, the most that she can do was mostly just simply, increase her knowledge in order to assist Luffy and the rest of his crew. So there was that. But Luffy would, of course, still offer her training in private as long as the information doesn't go out of his crew or forces. As now, with that being said, this is where we end up seeing a majority of Luffy's adventures through the Grand Line go by extremely smoothly, as every one of Luffy's crewmates would then take care of the threats that Ken and Luffy would deal with. As in Thriller Bark, they would take care of Gecko Moria, and soon moving on to Sabaody, they would end up taking care of the, riffraff pirates that were causing trouble. As, of course, the whole events that end up happening in Sabaody, although not into an extreme extent, they did happen to some degree. As after all, Kid and Law were still there, so Luffy made sure to, of course, strike terror in their hearts while he was there and chilling. Or at least his crew made sure to do that, as Luffy's crew would be there to keep the peace and make sure that everything was controlled. But you see, while these events would go by, this is where we end up seeing other events also take place at the same time. For example, this being the event of Ace facing off against Blackbeard. And to your guys' surprise, in this timeline, Ace actually wins against Blackbeard and his crew. And the main reason why is because of the fact of Luffy's training, as Luffy's training made sure to push Ace far beyond his limits, and ever since then, Ace made sure to take inspiration from that, pushing himself to go further and further beyond. So strong that unfortunately Blackbeard just simply was not able to keep up with Ace and actually lost to him. Not only that, but Ace also became much more of a strategic thinker, so there was that as well. So yeah, Ace ends up winning against Blackbeard, so that meant that Ace does not get captured, which means the whole Summit War does not go by, allowing for things in the One Piece world to go by once again way smoother than it did in the main timeline. But you see, turning back to Luffy's crew though, by the time that Sabaody would come to an end, after many of the pirates would get away or many of them get turned in, this is when Luffy then came to a very certain realization. As after looking at his crew and everything, and after understanding every last one of them, this is where Luffy would then decide to make it official, as he then tells them all that they're going to have to go on a little bit of a break. Now this will cause them to immediately despair, as they think that the entirety of their crew was now breaking up, with of course Nami actually getting right into Luffy's face and declaring that she's not going anywhere, and Chopper doing the same thing, and basically many of the people that joined Luffy's crew, for Luffy especially, they were trying to deny the whole request of separating. But this is when Luffy then shakes off the confusion by simply telling them that they were doing this to grow stronger, as Luffy decides to be completely brutally honest with his crew, telling them that they were all way too weak. The new world was something completely different, and unfortunately, although they were greatly strong, the only one that would probably survive it at all, or no, the one that was most definitely going to survive it was Luffy at the end of the day. But the rest of them, he was unsure of. Now this will cause them all to realize exactly that their captain was basically trying to keep them safe, but it still stung to hear the truth. As just like that, this is when Luffy would then call up a couple of connections, as we will end up seeing the rest of Luffy's crew then disband for a little while in order to train and grind up. As Luffy then lets them know that by the next time that they're all ready to head out to seas, that they're going to be able to take on the new world, and more importantly that they're going to turn in a bunch of pirates. And this will cause the crew to then get fired up, as every last one of them would then go their separate ways, except for Robin, as after all, she has to stay with Luffy due to the certain conditions placed on her, which Luffy was okay with. As after that, this is where we then see Luffy and the rest of his crew continue on with their own training arcs, as this is where we now do a time skip for 2 years. Now during the time of the 2 years, Luffy and his crew have made a tremendous amount of progress, Luffy especially, as during this time Luffy was still heading out on missions, and the main reason why is because of the fact that while Luffy gave his crew a break, Luffy could not give himself a break, unless the Marines themselves decide to allow him to do so. So due to that, Luffy still had to do missions while also training, but this was just another training for Luffy at the end of the day, as he took on a variety of pirates every now and then, causing him to grow stronger and stronger and learning how to master his devil fruit, to which he eventually does so. And to say that Luffy had grown powerful would be an understatement, as he had grown so powerful that already people were already placing his names on the level of that of Whitebeard, Rogers, and Kaido, and heck even Garp, as many people were comparing Luffy to them. As the thing is, Luffy was making many headlines during this time, as he even got a new title, a new moniker, as many people begin to actually call Luffy the Great Thunder God of the Seas. Now, when Luffy actually heard this, at first he thought it was very lame, but unfortunately many people actually were very afraid of this title, as every single pirate that came across Luffy will begin begging for their lives, to the point where they begin bowing and kissing the ground that Luffy walks on in order to convince him to spare their lives. To which Luffy would do so, of course, since he's not a monster all the time, but he will beat the living crap out of them. That was something that was just inevitable. As over the time, we see Luffy take on a variety of missions, to the point where at first it's just simple small ones, as it was just simple missions of gathering information and coming back, to much more dangerous ones, like literally invading Yonko territory. As yes, during that time, Luffy had once again climbed up the rankings. But the thing is, the rankings that he had gotten was at first an Admiral ranking, as during the 2 years, Luffy had more or less proven himself. But over time, this is when Luffy would then get another challenge, as this will be during the time of the end of the 2 years. As during the end of the 2 years, as Luffy had been able to accomplish so many missions, and by this point he was already an Admiral, this is when Luffy would then be given an offer. Basically, he was supposed to contend with both Aokiji and Akainu to decide who's going to become the Fleet Admiral. Now you'll see Luffy had been kind of on the fence about this whole decision, as you see the main reason behind the fact that Luffy was, taking so long for consideration to become a Fleet Admiral was mostly because of the fact that Luffy was way too young, and he was still way too young to many other people. But the one thing they couldn't deny was the fact that Luffy's popularity, his skills and abilities, and not only that, but this weird amount of intelligence and wisdom that he has was more or less befitting of a Fleet Admiral. So with that, they decided to give him a shot. Although they were still skeptical about it, they decided to really just let the rest of them decide. It was going to be a brawl, and they were going to see exactly who's going to win. And whoever wins was going to be the one to become a Fleet Admiral. So with that, this is where we would then see the fight between Aokiji, Akainu, and Luffy, as we end up seeing the three individuals actually be dropped off at Punk Hazard, as every last one of them would stare down at each other, with Aokiji being surprised that Luffy was there but begins laughing, telling Luffy that he should have expected this, with Luffy chuckling as well. But Akainu was not laughing at all, as he glares at the two of them before calmly telling them that he's going to become the Fleet Admiral. And Luffy, after hearing this, just simply turns to him with a bored expression, as Aokiji then begins to flare up his own Devil Fruit ability, as we see the entire area get filled with both magma and ice, with Luffy seeing this just sighing, as he then begins to release his own energy as well, as we end up seeing electricity begin to fill up the area too. As just like that, the three of them would then stare down at each other before they would then rush, as Aokiji and Akainu would then clash, with Luffy then intervening in the middle, as he then stabs them both with lightning swords. Now this will cause the two of them to be stunned for a little while, allowing Luffy the opportunity to then kick both of them away and sending them flying. Luckily they're able to recover, as Akainu would then get angry, as he would then send a magma fist up into the air, causing a ginormous meteor shower to then fall. And Luffy, seeing this, is able to dodge, of course turning himself into lightning, as he's able to dodge this relatively easily. And Aokiji, seeing how fast Luffy was running and of course dodging out of the way of the magma, this is when he then gets an idea. As this is when Aokiji would then suddenly slam his hand into the ground before screaming out Ice Age, as he decides to try to freeze the entirety of the arena. But you see, Luffy, of course being lightning and moving incredibly fast, he would then jump over the Ice Age, with Akainu countering with his magma, causing the two of them to still remain standing even after everything. As after seeing that all of them were fine, this is where they all begin to power up, as Akainu begins to summon out more and more magma, with Aokiji summoning out even more ice, and this is where from the skies above we would then see a ginormous storm begin to build up, as thunder begins to clap throughout the skies, with Luffy looking down at them coldly. As just like that, we would then see the three individuals then rush at each other with a powerful collision, shaking up the entirety of Punk Hazard. Now the fight between the three of them was definitely one for the ages, as this took up many days. In fact, it took more than 2 weeks. Yes, a whole 2 weeks of them straight doing nothing more but fighting. It was shocking to say the least. As by the time they actually got reports about Punk Hazard, they would then find out that the entirety of the area had been decimated, as there had been nothing left behind after the fight between the three of them. Now during that fight, Luffy had been able to use majority of his techniques, as of course the admirals were more than capable of handling it. As Luffy had so much of a struggle against them that he even brought out chakra, as Luffy began releasing fireballs, water jutsus, and using everything to his advantage. And needless to say, although Aokiji and Akainu were definitely strong in their own right, eventually one victor was decided. As by the time that the Marines finally pulled up to the scene, as they see the majority of Punk Hazard, or what was once left of it, as they end up seeing something very particular. As currently right now, they will see Aokiji standing, but you see he was very much damaged and he was currently right now on his last legs, and it kind of would be the same thing, as we end up seeing that he was nearly missing his entire arm, as his entire arm looked completely fried and damaged. Although we end up seeing Luffy, who looked like he was the one that took the least amount of damage, but you could see that he was pretty damaged as well. As the three of them will be looking at each other, each one of them on their own side of the now destroyed island, before they would then glare, realizing that this was now the last strike. As with a mighty battle cry, this is where every last one of them would then charge up their last attack. As we see Akainu charging up a ginormous meteor at the palm of his hand, with Aokiji preparing a ginormous amount of ice to appear on both sides of his hands, as he decides that he's going to try to freeze the both of them, with Luffy deciding to resort to his last technique. As we end up seeing a white and blue lightning dragon appear on Luffy's hand, before suddenly he would then add Haki into it, and more importantly, the Supreme King's Haki. As we end up seeing that Luffy's currently right now lightning dragon was transforming into a black and red one. As every last one of these individuals would stare at each other, the Marines that were there to pick them up would then immediately begin to to retreat, as they realized that here and now they were going to see the final collision. As with a battle cry, every last one of them would then jump at each other, as Aokiji, Akainu, and Luffy would then slam their respective attacks. And just like that, right as their attacks would then slam, we would then see the sky itself then split, as a ginormous lightning dragon then emerges from the collision between the three, as it takes up into the sky, releasing a ginormous roar and pushing back many of the ships. And not only that, but also splitting up the seas greatly. As by the time the collision had finally come to an end, the last thing they would ever see would be every last one of these individuals that were part of the clash falling into the oceans before suddenly getting slapped by it. As just like that, the fight between Luffy, Aokiji, and Akainu had came to the end, as every last one of these ships would then finally sail their way over there to see who had won. Now, after searching around for quite a while as they go through the seas looking for every last one of them, this is when eventually the victor was seen. As we end up seeing Luffy, currently right now damaged beyond belief, but so far right now he was still there conscious, as he was looking at the ships, waving his hands over there, showing that he was absolutely in pain and everything, but he looked extremely tired. And along with him would be none other than Aokiji and Akainu, who were both unconscious. As the main reason why they were still afloat on top of the water was because of the fact of Luffy's chakra, as he had been using it to maintain them up above the water so that way the rest of the Marines can see them. As just like that, on that very day, the victor had been decided, and not only that, but the fleet admiral had been decided as well. As after that very day, although many people were still questioning the decision, Luffy had been made a fleet admiral, and not only that, but he had been made the youngest one possible. Now this will cause guards to just begin laughing, as he can't help but just be amazed at his grandson, with Luffy just taking up the responsibility in just under 2 years. I mean, it was still like 2 years regardless, but still, like, Luffy had done it basically in under 2 years. And to say Luffy was excited would be, well, not true at all. Basically, he was pretty tired with the hassle of the responsibility, but still he decided to go through with it. And the main reason why is because of the fact that Luffy over time, he realized a couple of things. Just being the true evils of the Marines, as he had been able to gain access to the information that they try to conceal, allowing him to see many different events that transpired. For example, the events that happened with Robin's village, as when Luffy found out that they basically destroyed the entirety of the island just because of the fact these people were able to read some very special text, he couldn't believe it, as this made him realize that something needs to change. And while he would love to give that responsibility to someone else, which he already had an idea exactly who could do it, unfortunately for now he decided to take up the mantle. as after all, currently right now, this world did not have a Naruto just yet. And speaking of that Naruto, he was still building up, which if you guys don't know, I'm talking about Kobe. And Luffy knew about it. He knew that Kobe definitely had the potential for this. But for now, someone had to start making the action now before things will turn out bad later on. So with that, Luffy decided to take on the responsibility, as we now finally turn to the very present after those 2 years. Now, after Luffy had become the fleet admiral, you might have think that he immediately had no choice but to resign from duty and just focus on working back at the Marine base. But that was actually false, or better yet, that was not entirely true. And the main reason why Luffy was actually able to do more than that was because of something very simple known as shadow clones. That's right, Luffy had decided to abuse his chakra by simply creating shadow clones so that they could do the paperwork while he goes on adventures with his crew. Which of course they greatly appreciated him for it, to which Luffy ends up telling him that it was no problem, as every last one of them had improved greatly, far surpassing their canon counterpart, with Zoro being so strong by this point where he's actually able to give Dracula Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman, a actual really good fight that's able to push both of them to their absolute limit. As just like that, this is where we would then see for the next few moments Luffy and the rest of his crew going on many adventures, taking on multiple different threats. Luffy would be there trying his best to try to change the policies of the Marines, and not only that, but also changing exactly how the bounty system was working. As now that Luffy was an admiral, he'll be trying his best to make the policy change, as he had changed it to exactly how his philosophy saw it, to look underneath the underneath, basically to look much closer than expected. As after all, this allowed people to see which pirates were, good or just simply going out there for an adventure, as they were not really pirates but more or less just adventurers, while others were just truly pirates, just complete scumbags. So this will cause the bounties to immediately change for many pirates, as Luffy and his crew would continue on going on different adventures. They would go take on, Doflamingo and Dressrosa, as they were able to take them on after many requests from different people about taking care of Dressrosa, to which Luffy of course decided to step in, allowing for Doflamingo to be captured and also sent to Impel Down, which by the way, Impel Down is most definitely still standing. And soon afterwards, after the whole events that happened at Dressrosa, we would then get the events at Whole Cake Island, where once again Luffy and his forces were able to pretty much take care of the whole event, as they were even able to take care of a Yonko, as Luffy versus Big Mom did end up happening, with the fight being so powerful that it split the sky and shook up the entirety of Whole Cake Island. But still, regardless of that, Big Mom had been defeated, as once again Luffy will once again be in front of many news articles, as basically the story of Luffy's journey will be going down in the history books, as his legend was so powerful and continued growing by this point that by many people's standards, Luffy had surpassed Garp in every single way. As we end up seeing the rest of Luffy's adventures play out, mostly similar to the main timeline, with him defeating more and more Yonkos, capturing more and more pirates, and just changing the system of the Marines itself, as Luffy was most definitely making a change. As this is where we now turn to one of the very last few instances, this being the Wano country. As by this point now, Luffy, as well as many of the other Marines, had basically declared a full-on war on Kaido and his entire crew, to which Kaido not wanting to back down and actually wanting to fight Luffy after hearing the rumors would accept this. As we end up seeing a very long dragged out war in the Wano country, as many people were trying their best to defeat the other side. But you see, that was not the main event here, no. Instead, the main event was Kaido versus Luffy. As we end up seeing Luffy, as by this point now, Kaido would just be there with his ginormous club, and just to let you know, Kaido is not drunk at all. No, he is fully here, fully focused and preparing for Luffy. As just thinking about Luffy, this is when he would then arrive, as Kaido would then look up into the sky to see a ginormous storm had arrived, and that was Luffy's go-to entry, which causes Kaido to smirk, as just like that, falling from the sky above will be none other than a ginormous lightning bolt that would appear right in front of Kaido, to which he doesn't flinch. As just like that, appearing out of the smoke will be none other than Luffy, who stares down Kaido, as Luffy would be wearing his Fleet Admiral clothing, letting Kaido know that this will be the end of the line. And Kaido, after hearing this, would then tell Luffy to bring it on, saying that this was not going to be no normal fight, and that instead this was going to be one of their graves, telling Luffy to give it all he's got, as after all, he wants to make sure that this fight goes down in the history books. And Luffy, after hearing this, would agree, as this is where we then have Luffy facing off against Kaido. Now, two combatants would then rush at each other, as Luffy would then rush at him with a lightning blade, with Kaido rushing at Luffy with his club, with both attacks colliding with each other, causing a ginormous shockwave to appear and shake up the entirety of the land of Wano. As we end up seeing Luffy actually bounce away from the attack a little bit, as he then gets into a taijutsu battle with Kaido, which at first Kaido begins to shrug off the blows, thinking that they were not going to do anything, until Luffy then begins to go faster, then faster, then faster. And not only that, but this is when Kaido then realizes that these blows were actually doing him pretty good damage, as he begins to feel himself get phantom pain here and there, as this is when Luffy then begins to apply haki into them. And just like that, this is when Kaido begins to really feel the pain, as he feels himself bombarded with a bunch of shards just seemingly piercing his skin, as that's how Luffy's punches, or better yet, that's how his attacks felt like. And Kaido, sensing all this pain, would then suddenly push Luffy aside, as this is when he then begins chuckling, as he then enters his dragon transformation, as he looms over Luffy. Now Luffy would be there staring down the dragon Kaido, as many people turned their attention onto the fight, wondering what was going on, as Kaido then compliments Luffy for his strength before suddenly raining down a ginormous amount of fireballs on Luffy, to which Luffy, seeing this, then begins the act, as he then begins to immediately summon out a ginormous fireball, or more precisely dragon flame bombs, directly at the ginormous balls of fire that Kaido had released, allowing for Luffy to counter Kaido's attack with relative ease, and causing Kaido to be once again very happy, as he would then charge up a beam in order to shoot it directly at Luffy. But Luffy, seeing this, would have other ideas, as this one suddenly he would then summon out his own lightning dragon, as he ends up shooting it directly into Kaido's mouth, causing it to immediately misfire in Kaido's throat and causing him some very bad damage internally, and also causing him to snap out of his dragon form relatively quickly. As we end up seeing Kaido turn back into his, regular human form, as he ends up getting up before laughing, telling Luffy that he really was impressed, before finally this is when he would then enter into his hybrid form, telling Luffy that now is finally time for them to both get serious. And Luffy, seeing this, would then tell Kaido to bring it on, as this is where we then get the battle between hybrid Kaido versus Luffy. As just like that, the two combatants would then rush at each other, with their battle being so cinematic to the point where it will look like similar to that of a Dragon Ball Z battle, as we see the two of them just clashing through the air, as each one of them will be sending their best blows at each other, as Kaido was giving it all he's got with a smile on his face, as he ends up telling Luffy how much he appreciates him, with Luffy saying nothing more but continuously fighting Kaido. As we end up seeing the two of them clash once again, but this time being way more destructive, as Luffy would then suddenly end up calling out a purple lightning, with Kaido releasing the Supreme King's Haki, causing him to gain the upper hand and causing the attack to actually send Luffy flying a little bit. Now Kaido would end up landing on the ground with a smile on his face, as Luffy would take in some pretty massive damage to his arm, after of course not suspecting just how much power Kaido was going to add into the attack. But still, it didn't matter, as Luffy still had more than enough energy to keep on fighting. And Kaido, seeing this, would then begin laughing, as this is where we would then see Luffy then begin to do one-handed hand signs. Two ginormous water dragons would then rise up from the sea, as they then begin to actually loom over Kaido. Now Kaido would be there amazed, as he can't help but once again compliment Luffy, telling him how amazing he was, as Luffy would then shoot the water dragons directly at Kaido, as Luffy would be tensing with a smile on his face. As you see, the thing is, Luffy was still not used to doing these hand signs with one hand alone, but there was a reason why Luffy was doing it. As the two water dragons would hit Kaido extremely hard and causing him to gain a little bit of weakness, this is when Luffy would then charge up a ginormous amount of lightning, as this is when he once again calls out purple lightning, but this time it was way stronger. As just like that, Kaido would then be hit by the purple lightning that was increased by the water he just gotten hit with, as we end up seeing him get very badly electrocuted, so badly to the point where his body looks like it's almost completely burnt. But yet, even after taking a ginormous amount of water, and by the way, that was seawater, so that was a weakness to Devil Fruit users, and not only that, but also taking a full bolt of electricity, we end up seeing Kaido still standing. As this is when he then once again compliments Luffy, thanking him for this opportunity, as this is where Kaido then decides to go out to his final form. As with using his dragon transformation one last time, this is where Luffy, as well as the entirety of the land of Wano, would then see none other than a ginormous flaming dragon appear right above them, as this was one of Kaido's ace technique that he had for a very long time, telling Luffy that this was all thanks to his strength that Kaido was able to actually draw upon this power once again. And Luffy seeing the powerful form of Kaido, this is when he once again sighs before powering up himself. He ends up remembering the memories of his old life, remembering everything he experienced, and also the memories of this life. As this is when Luffy, or should I say Kakashi, would then begin to mutter in his mind, telling his old friend that this technique was inspired by him. As this is when suddenly lightning begins to fill around Luffy as it then begins to take shape. As Kaido and everyone else would then watch in surprise, as this is when a ginormous samurai-like armor would then be built around Luffy, but instead of it being made of chakra, it was instead made of lightning, pure lightning. As this technique, Luffy would actually call it Susanoo. As you see, Luffy, or should I say Kakashi, have been able to actually once again recreate his very own Susanoo, with the only sad thing being the fact that he doesn't have the Kamui. But that was okay since he had the Susanoo after all, with the only difference here being the fact that instead of it being made of chakra, it was instead made of lightning. But he could actually add chakra into it, making it more powerful. As just like that, we see Kakashi, or should I say Luffy, in this ginormous dome of lightning armor, all the while Kaido would be there amazed. As this is where he would then begin laughing before rushing at Luffy, telling him to give it all he got, with Luffy doing the same thing. As just like that, this is where we would then see both legendary titans then rush at each other before colliding in one last devastating blow. As Luffy would then summon out a ginormous lightning spear, with Kaido rushing at Luffy in his fire dragon form, as we end up seeing the two of them then clash with each other, as their clash was so powerful that not only did it split the skies, but it also split the entirety of the land of Wano, as everyone would be amazed by the power of these guys, before suddenly one by one every last one of them would then begin to cheer for the respective captain, as all of Kaido's crewmates would then begin cheering him on, telling him not to lose, with the Marines doing the same thing for Luffy. But right as they were thinking this though, this was suddenly a ginormous amount of smoke then fills in the entire area, as suddenly falling from the sky above, this is where we then see two people falling as they will then hit the ground hard, once again shaking up the entirety of the land of Wano. On one hand, we see Luffy as he was extremely damaged, and not only that, but he was just beaten and bruised all over. Like, this man looked barely recognizable, but yet he was still conscious even after all of that. As Luffy would then painfully move his body to the left to see how exactly things were looking on Kaido's end, only to see something that caused Luffy to feel reassurance and also a little bit of pity. As just like that, we would then see Kaido, but the thing is, Kaido had became Kaido. And by that I mean this man's body, or more precisely, the midsection of his body, had been split in half completely. As Luffy, in this timeline, had Gojo'd Kaido. And Kaido, at these final moments as he ends up passing away, we actually see that instead of, being mad or showing any fear, he had a ginormous smile on his face. As just like that, this will be the end for the war in Wano, as one of the Marines would then announce the outcome of the battle between Luffy and Kaido. As this is where we now do one last time skip. So for the final moments of this what if, we're now going to flash forward to the future, as we end up seeing things begin to settle down now. We see the world of One Piece becoming much more of a healthier environment, as society has changed up quite a bit. Number one being the fact that celestial dragons by this point are basically an unimportant title. And by that I mean celestial dragons don't get nearly the same status as they once had. And not only that, but if someone were to pick a fight with the celestial dragon, they wouldn't get in trouble unless they were the ones who were actively looking for a fight. So yeah, basically celestial dragons were now back to being just regular people. And this was a very tough time for them to adjust, as they kept trying to regain their status and power, but the Marines were changing. Or so I say, someone was making a change. Yup, this being none other than the new fleet admiral himself, Kobe. Come on now, did you actually think it was going to be Luffy in this timeline? Nah, that man wants no part of any of that. He was only doing it so that way things can continue on much more healthier. And he always planned to give away that title to Kobe since he was more or less more deserving of it than him. It was a similar situation to how Kakashi became the 6th Hokage and not Naruto. So yeah, Kakashi, or should I say Luffy in this timeline, passed the title of Fleet Admiral to Kobe, who worked his butt off for it. And if you're wondering for the rest of the crew, we end up seeing that every last one of them begin to actually get their own forces or get their own side of recognition. For example, Chopper was known as the best doctor in the entire world of One Piece. As any disease that was out there, he had been able to find a cure for it. We also end up seeing Nami, as by this point she finally succeeded in her dream of drawing a map of the entire world. And this map was so perfect, they actually was able to go on news articles, and not only that, but even after so many years, it was still worshipped by many, since Nami had put her entire soul into it. As we end up seeing that Nami as well as Chopper were not the only ones to achieve their dreams, as every individual that had joined Luffy along his journey had been able to do so. As every last one of them, including Zoro, Sanji, Robin, all of them have been able to succeed in their dreams. And if you're wondering for Luffy himself, Luffy had actually decided to step away from the Marines for a little while. Not to say that he was retired or anything like that, he was just on a very long break. As Luffy had decided to simply relax for a very long time, as now that everyone else was now doing their own thing, he could actually chill. He didn't really need to force himself to do a bunch of jobs like he did when he was younger. As instead, Luffy was just casually enjoying his life, reading his books in peace, and was already thinking about more events about what to do in the future. But just as Luffy was thinking this, as we now turn to him, this is where suddenly he would then be actually caught up on by none other than Ace. As you see, by this point now, the way that pirates are defined has completely changed as well. As you see, instead of it just simply being all pirates are bad, the standard has changed to being there are good pirates and there are bad pirates. As depending on their actions, their bounty has most definitely changed, as after all, the ones that were good were the ones that barely made any real problems for the world government, except for exposing the truth of their evil deeds. Although the bad ones were, well, they were just simply bad. So that means that their bounties were more or less increasing and would most of the time be caught in 7 or 6 days. So that meant that they weren't really that much of a threat anyway, as basically the entire pirate era was slowly but surely slipping away. But you see, the thing is, Luffy was okay with it, and so were many others. The world was constantly changing. The Gorosei and basically the entirety of the world government was also changing its electives and its entirely new position, thanks to Kobe's influence and also many others. Revolutionaries also began to come out, as that was actually another thing that Luffy found out, as somehow during the time of his journey, Sabo, instead of becoming a pirate, he had actually changed his profession to that of a revolutionary, which actually ended up working pretty well in Luffy's favor, as he actually made a deal with Dragon, his father, allowing for the two of them to catch up and also causing even more change to occur around the world, before eventually Kobe stepped up and became the Fleet Admiral. Luffy's decisions and everything that he did in the past had been able to catch up to him to build up this new future. As now the very last scene we see from this What If will be Luffy himself, as we see him just casually once again reading his book before suddenly getting approached by his brothers, this being Ace and Sabo, as they begin telling Luffy about an uncharted island, asking Luffy if he wants to come along. As like I said, by this point now, the whole thing about good and bad pirates has been pretty much getting established, or has been very well established, so that means it wasn't really that odd for a marine and pirates to actually hang out. And Luffy, after hearing this, just simply sighs at their childishness before agreeing to it, as just like that, this is where we will then see Luffy and the rest of his brothers then go out on an adventure. As the very last scene we would see would be Luffy, as he ends up having a light smile on his face that was still covered by a mask, but you can still see the outline of a smile as he then continues on living his life. As now, with that being said, y'all, this will be the end to What If Luffy was Kakashi's reincarnation. Thank y'all so much for watching this video. This video was most definitely a lot to take in. Man, One Piece What Ifs are just wow. Very much wow. Yeah, I've not done a One Piece What If in a very long time, and you guys can obviously tell it right here, right now. But yeah, guys, it was definitely an enjoyable experience. I personally really like this What If. I know many people might not like a very good, happy ending. I know some people like a much darker one, but me personally, I like happy endings, and here's the What If with the happy ending. But yeah, y'all, I don't really got much else to say. I really hope you guys like this new idea of mine of me just uploading every single week. And yeah, that's really all I have to say. So with that being said, y'all, it's your host Seishi Samurai here. He is extremely tired and he's about to head off to bed. So with that being said, y'all, It's your host, and he's signing off. Peace, and have a lovely day.
Colors, colors.